Good evening, and welcome, weary traveller, to a hushed corner of history. Tonight, as we prepare to ease you gently into slumber, we're going to delve into the, shall we say, less restful aspects of medieval life. Yes, we're venturing onto the battlefield, a place far removed from the idyllic images of castles and courtly love that sometimes spring to mind. Prepare to have those romantic notions gently dispelled. We're talking about medieval warfare, not the sanitized Hollywood version, but the gritty, brutal reality. This isn't a tale of valiant knights in shining armor always behaving chivalrously, engaging in honorable single combat. Far from it. Think instead of muddy fields, desperate men, and the ever-present stench of, well, let's just say things weren't always fresh as a daisy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So what exactly was medieval warfare? It's a sprawling topic encompassing a vast period, roughly from the fall of the Roman Empire around the 5th century, right through to the advent of gunpowder and more modern armies around the 15th century. A whole millennium of conflict, that's a lot of battles. And these weren't neatly contained skirmishes, friends. We're talking about sieges that dragged on for years, campaigns that decimated entire regions, and wars that reshaped the very map of Europe. Think of the Norman Conquest, the Crusades, the 100 Years' War. These were events that shaped identities and destinies. Now, before your imagination conjures up images of glory and triumph, let me paint a clearer, perhaps more sobering picture. Medieval warfare was, at its core, a chaotic and horrifying affair. The battlefield was a place of extreme violence, of course, but also of disease, starvation, and utter exhaustion. The weaponry, while sometimes beautifully crafted, was designed for one purpose: to maim and kill. Swords, axes, maces, arrows, all instruments of brutal efficiency. Imagine for a moment the sound of a battle. The clash of steel on steel, the screams of the wounded, the thunder of hooves, the guttural cries of men locked in a desperate struggle for survival. It's a far cry from the soaring orchestral scores of the movies. And that's just the auditory experience. The smell, as mentioned earlier, was equally unforgettable. Unwashed bodies, sweating under heavy armor. The stench of blood, mingled with the earthy odor of mud and the decaying remains of men and animals left to rot on the field. Add to that the acrid smell of smoke from burning villages, and you have a sensory experience that would stay with you for the rest of your days if you survived, that is. But medieval warfare wasn't just about the physical experience of battle. It was also deeply intertwined with the social, economic, and political realities of the time. Feudal obligations meant that lords were required to provide soldiers to their kings and dukes. This system of loyalty and service shaped the composition of medieval armies. And of course there was the ever-present issue of money. Wars cost a lot of money. Equipping soldiers, supplying armies, building castles, it all required vast resources. Medieval rulers were constantly searching for ways to fund their conflicts, whether through taxation, plunder, or borrowing from wealthy merchants. Now, a common misconception is that medieval warfare was purely a matter of brute force. While strength and courage were certainly important, strategy and tactics also played a crucial role. Medieval commanders had to consider terrain, weather, and logistics when planning their campaigns. They had to decide when to engage the enemy, when to retreat, and how to best utilize their available resources. Siege warfare, in particular, was a complex and sophisticated art. Taking a castle wasn't simply a matter of storming the walls. It involved a long and often arduous process of blockade, bombardment, and undermining. Siege engines like catapults and trebuchets hurled massive stones at the defenders, while miners dug tunnels beneath the walls, attempting to collapse them from below. And castles, of course, were more than just defensive structures. They were centers of power, symbols of authority, and strategic strongholds that controlled territory and trade routes. Owning a castle meant owning the surrounding area. So in this soothing, sleepy journey of ours, we'll be exploring all of these aspects of medieval warfare in more detail. We'll be looking at the types of soldiers who fought, the weapons they used, the tactics they employed, and the castles they defended. We'll be examining the role of knights, those mounted warriors who often dominate our image of the Middle Ages. We'll also explore the importance of infantry, those foot soldiers who formed the backbone of most medieval armies. And we definitely won't forget the archers, especially those wielding the dreaded English longbow. But remember, friends, this isn't a celebration of violence. It's an attempt to understand the realities of a past age, to see beyond the romanticized myths, and to appreciate the human cost of conflict. It's also a reminder that warfare, in any era, is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, shaped by a variety of factors and driven by a range of motivations. So as you settle in and allow your mind to wander through the muddy fields and besieged castles of the Middle Ages, remember to keep a healthy dose of skepticism and a willingness to confront the less savory aspects of this fascinating period. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll drift off to sleep with a newfound appreciation for the relative peace and comfort of our own time. This series, as you gently close your eyes, isn't about glorifying medieval violence. Rather, it will peel back the romanticized layers and get to the very sinew and marrow of what conflict was like in the Middle Ages. We will see the men, not as knights errant, but as mortal individuals prone to fear, to anger, to every emotion that we ourselves experience. We will see the battles, not as glorious charges and shining victories, but as the horrific, chaotic, messy affairs they truly were. We will not linger on heroism, for that is fleeting and rare. Instead, we will look at the long sieges, the brutal winters, the supply lines, and how all these things affected the average soldier in the field. We will see the mud, the blood, and the sheer boredom of war as those men lived it. And finally, as you slip further into sleep, we will explore how the echoes of these conflicts reverberate through our own history, shaping the world we know today. The medieval era laid the foundations for many of the political and social structures that still exist. Understanding its warfare is understanding the world. So, let's take a deep breath now, and as your eyelids grow heavier and heavier, let's begin our journey into the brutal truth about medieval warfare. It may not be pretty, but it's undeniably fascinating. And who knows, it might just be the perfect antidote to a restless night, pleasant dreams, or perhaps a restful remembrance. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's get nice and cozy as we delve into the less than glamorous realities of medieval battlefields. Forget the shining armor and heroic charges for a moment, and let's just relax and imagine the mud, the rain, and the everything else. It might not sound soothing at first, but trust me, a clear understanding of just how unpleasant these battlefields were can be surprisingly calming. After all, sometimes facing the grim reality helps us appreciate our warm beds and dry socks all the more. So the medieval battlefield. Picture this, not some manicured lawn perfect for a modern war movie, but a field maybe, or a swamp, or a forest, pretty much anywhere that two armies decided to meet and bash each other. Terrain was rarely chosen for strategic advantage. Often it was dictated by where the lords involved held land or where a pre-arranged meeting point was. This meant armies fought on whatever the local geography threw at them. Think about that for a second. You're a soldier, right? You've probably walked for days to get to this place. You're tired, maybe hungry, and definitely not thrilled about the prospect of getting stabbed. Now imagine your battlefield is a boggy field after a week of rain. Every step you take sucks your boots down into the mud. Your armor, which already felt heavy, is now caked in muck, weighing you down even more. Trying to keep your footing while swinging a sword or a polearm becomes a Herculean effort, sapping your strength and making you an easy target. Not very heroic, is it? More like a very, very slow, wet slog. And it wasn't just bogs, of course. Dense forests presented their own challenges. Imagine trying to maintain formation in thick woods, branches snagging your clothes and armor, the enemy lurking behind every tree. Communication becomes almost impossible, and the whole thing devolves into a chaotic mess of small, brutal skirmishes. Hilltops, while offering a potential advantage, also meant a tiring climb for anyone trying to assault them, leaving them breathless and vulnerable. Rivers, forget about it. Crossing a river under enemy fire was a logistical nightmare, and many a medieval battle turned into a slaughter at a riverbank. Speaking of water, let's talk about the weather. We romanticize battles, right? We imagine epic clashes under a bright sun or a dramatic thunderstorm. And hey, those probably happened sometimes. But more often than not, the weather on a medieval battlefield was just miserable. Rain was a common enemy, turning fields into quagmires, rusting armor, and soaking soldiers to the bone. Imagine spending days in wet clothes and heavy armor, the constant dampness chafing your skin and making you shiver uncontrollably. It's a recipe for hypothermia, sickness, and a general feeling of utter despair. Heat was no picnic, either. Battles fought in the summer months could be brutal, especially for soldiers encased in metal armor. The heat stroke was a real threat, turning armor into a personal oven. Medieval illustrations sometimes show soldiers collapsing from exhaustion and heat, and it's easy to see why. And then there's winter. Oh, winter. Fighting in winter meant battling not only the enemy, but also frostbite, starvation, and exposure. Rivers froze, making them easier to cross, but also making the ground treacherous and the wind even more biting. Supply lines were stretched to their breaking point, and armies often suffered more casualties from the cold and hunger than from actual combat. Ever heard the phrase General Winter? It's not a joke. Now, let's move on to logistics. This is the really fun part. Or, well, maybe fun isn't the right word. Fascinatingly awful might be more accurate. Supplying a medieval army was a Herculean task, a constant struggle against distance, time, and the sheer inefficiency of medieval infrastructure. Think about it. No trucks, no trains, no helicopters. Everything had to be transported by, what? Wagons, pack animals, or, even worse, on the backs of soldiers. An army on the march required vast quantities of food, water, weapons, armor, and all the other paraphernalia of war. Feeding thousands of soldiers, plus their horses, was a monumental undertaking. The most common solution was foraging, that is, stealing food from the local population. Armies would simply march through the countryside, taking whatever they needed from the peasants. This, unsurprisingly, didn't make them very popular. It also tended to lead to widespread famine and devastation, as the locals were left with nothing to survive on. Organized supply trains were rare and often unreliable. Wagons broke down, roads turned to mud, and bandits preyed on vulnerable supply convoys. Even when supplies did arrive, they were often of poor quality. Food spoiled quickly, water became contaminated, and disease spread like wildfire. And let's not forget the animals. Horses were essential for cavalry, but they also required vast amounts of food and water. A war horse needed far more sustenance than a foot soldier, putting an even greater strain on already stretched supply lines. And what happened when a horse died? Well, that was one less mount, and one more rotting carcass attracting flies and spreading disease. Lovely, isn't it? Another major logistical challenge was simply moving men and equipment. Medieval armies traveled at a snail's pace, averaging only a few miles a day. This meant that campaigns could drag on for months, even years, with armies spending more time marching and foraging than actually fighting. This also made them vulnerable to ambush and harassment, as the enemy could easily track their progress and choose the time and place to strike. The lack of sanitation was another huge problem. Medieval armies were basically giant cesspools on the move. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food, it all combined to create a perfect breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses were rampant and often killed more soldiers than enemy weapons. Medical care, or the lack thereof, only made things worse. Battlefield medicine was rudimentary, to say the least. Surgeons had limited knowledge of anatomy and hygiene, and often did more harm than good. Wounds were cauterized with hot irons, limbs were amputated without anesthesia, and infections were treated with questionable herbal remedies. If you got seriously injured on a medieval battlefield, your chances of survival were slim. And what about after the battle? The aftermath of a medieval battle was a horrific sight. The field was littered with corpses, both human and animal, stripped of their valuables and left to rot. The wounded lay moaning in agony, waiting for help that might never come. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder of the brutal reality of medieval warfare. All of this, combined with the constant threat of violence and the ever-present fear of death, took a heavy toll on the soldiers' morale. Desertion was a common problem, especially when conditions were particularly harsh. Soldiers would simply slip away in the night, hoping to escape the horrors of war and return to their homes. So there you have it, a glimpse into the wonderfully unpleasant reality of the medieval battlefield. Terrain, weather, and logistics conspired to make medieval warfare a truly miserable experience for everyone involved. It wasn't about glory or honor, it was about survival, endurance, and a whole lot of mud. Now, isn't that relaxing? Knowing just how bad it was back then can make us appreciate our comfortable lives a little bit more, right? It's like a historical gratitude exercise. So take a deep breath, snuggle into your blanket, and let's move on to the next chapter, where we'll explore the lives of the medieval soldiers who actually had to endure all of this. Sweet dreams, or at least, dreams that are slightly less muddy and miserable. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's drift into the world of the medieval soldier. Close your eyes, imagine the softest blanket, that's it. Now breathe, and let's learn about who these warriors actually were. Now forget the shining armor and chivalrous knights you see in movies. The reality of medieval armies was far more diverse, let's say, than Hollywood would have you believe. It wasn't just about noble lords on horseback. Most of the fighting was done by ordinary folks, just like you or me, maybe a little more accustomed to hardship though. So who were these people who made up the bulk of medieval armies? Well, you had a real mix. At the topish end you had the knights, of course. These were professional warriors, usually landowners who owed military service to a lord or king. They had the best equipment, the best training, and a social standing that separated them from the common rabble. But knights were really just the tip of the iceberg, a small, albeit important, tip. Beneath them were men-at-arms. These were also professional soldiers, but often not of noble birth. Think of them as highly skilled, well-equipped mercenaries or professional soldiers. Some may have been knights in training, but most were just skilled warriors who fought for pay. These were the backbone of many a medieval army, reliable, experienced, and often quite brutal. Then came the freemen. These were your farmers, your blacksmiths, your carpenters, ordinary people who were called upon to fight when needed. They might have owned a bit of land, or rented some, and they were obligated to serve their lord for a certain number of days each year. They weren't professional soldiers, not by a long shot. They had little training, and their equipment was usually pretty basic. Think pitchforks, axes, maybe a rusty sword if they were lucky. And below them were the unfree, serfs, peasants, people tied to the land. These guys had it the worst. They had no choice. When their lord called, they had to answer. They were usually the least equipped, the the least trained and the most expendable. These were the guys thrown into the front lines, often with little more than a prayer and a pointy stick. Grim stuff. So you've got this social hierarchy reflected in the army. Knights at the top, followed by men-at-arms, then freemen, and finally, the unfree at the very bottom. It wasn't a meritocracy, not in the slightest. Your social status largely determined your role and your chances of survival. Fair? Absolutely not. But that's medieval warfare for you. Now, why did these people fight? The knights, well, they fought because it was their duty. It was part of the feudal system. They owed military service to their lord in exchange for land and protection. It was all about oaths and obligations, and of course there was the chance for glory and renown, to prove their valor on the battlefield, win tournaments, and gain fame and fortune. It was a whole culture built around warfare. The men-at-arms, they fought for money. Pure and simple, they were professional soldiers. They got paid to fight, and they fought for whoever paid them the most. Loyalty wasn't exactly their strong suit. They were more concerned with survival and getting their next paycheck. Mercenaries, essentially. The freemen, well, they fought because they had to. Feudal obligation, again, they might not have wanted to fight, but they didn't have much of a choice. They were bound to their lord, and when he called, they had to answer. There was also a sense of community, of defending their homes and their families. But let's be honest, mainly it was fear of the consequences if they didn't show up. And the unfree, they fought because they were ordered to. No choice at all. They were essentially property. Their lord could do with them as he pleased, including sending them off to die in some pointless war. It was a brutal system, and they were at the very bottom of it. But there were other motivations too, woven into this grim tapestry of duty and obligation. Religion played a huge role. The Crusades, for example, were driven by religious zeal. The promise of salvation, of fighting for God, was a powerful motivator. Men flocked to the banners, eager to strike a blow against the infidel. The idea that dying in a holy war guaranteed a place in heaven, that was a potent incentive. Even in other conflicts, religion played a part. Kings often claimed to be fighting for God's will, to be divinely appointed rulers. This gave their wars a sense of legitimacy, a higher purpose. It helped to rally the troops and justify the bloodshed. Of course, it was often just a convenient excuse for land grabs and power struggles, but the religious element was always there. So what was the life of a common soldier actually like? Well, it wasn't exactly glamorous. Long marches, terrible food, constant danger. It was a hard life. Most of their time was spent marching, digging trenches, building fortifications, and generally being miserable. Food was usually pretty awful. Hardtack, a type of dry biscuit, was a staple. It was incredibly hard, often infested with weevils, and generally unappetizing. But it was cheap, and it lasted a long time. Then there was salted meat, which was usually tough, stringy, and incredibly salty. Vegetables were scarce and fresh water was often hard to find. Dysentery and other waterborne illnesses were rampant. Sleep was another luxury. Soldiers often slept on the ground, in their armor, exposed to the elements. They were constantly on alert, expecting an attack at any moment. Sleep deprivation was a major problem, making them tired, irritable, and more likely to make mistakes. And then there was the constant fear of death or injury. Medieval battles were brutal, chaotic affairs, close quarters combat with sharp weapons. It was a terrifying experience. Even if you survived the battle, there was a good chance you'd be wounded, and medical care was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly state of the art. Infection was a constant threat, and even minor wounds could easily turn deadly. Plus, let's not forget the looting and pillaging. It was common practice for soldiers to loot the countryside as they marched. They stole food, livestock, and anything else of value. They often raped and murdered civilians. It was a brutal, lawless environment, and soldiers were often given free rein to do whatever they wanted. It was a way to supplement their meager pay, and it was also a way to terrorize the enemy population. So the life of a medieval soldier was anything but romantic. It was a hard, dangerous, and often brutal existence. They weren't heroes in shining armor. They were ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, doing what they had to do to survive. They were motivated by duty, obligation, greed, religious zeal, and fear. They were a product of their time, a reflection of the harsh realities of medieval warfare. And it's important to remember that, when we think about medieval warfare, to look beyond the myths and legends, and to see the reality of what it was actually like for the men who fought in those battles. The common soldiers, the forgotten faces of history, who bore the brunt of the violence and hardship. They deserve to be remembered, not as heroes but as human beings who endured incredible suffering and hardship. That's a little about who they were and why they fought. Let that settle in. Close your eyes again, feel that blanket, and let it all just drift away. Alright then, let's get cozy and dive into the world of medieval arms and armor. Think of it as bedtime stories, but with swords and maybe a few axes. Definitely axes. Okay, so imagine you're a medieval warrior. What's the first thing you need? Well, besides courage and maybe a therapist, probably some gear. And that gear evolved quite a bit over time. We're talking centuries here, so the dude rocking up to the Battle of Hastings in 1066 is gonna look very different from a knight at, say, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Let's start simple. Early medieval weaponry, we're talking Dark Ages-esque stuff, was often pretty basic. A spear, an axe, maybe a short sword if you were lucky. And a shield, of course. The shield was your best friend. Round shields, kite shields, these were usually made of wood, often reinforced with iron bands or a boss in the center. They were crucial for deflecting blows, forming shield walls, and generally not dying horribly. Think of the Viking shield wall. Just imagine all those sturdy round shields, interlocked, forming a wall of wood and angry dudes. Effective? Absolutely. Impenetrable? Not so much, but definitely intimidating. And it was cheap, and that's important. See, cost was a huge factor in all of this. A peasant levy conscripted to fight for a lord wasn't going to be kitted out in fancy gear. They got what was available, what was cheap, and what could be mass-produced. A simple axe, a spear, maybe a padded tunic, that was about it. As we move into the High Middle Ages, things start to get a little more sophisticated. Mail armor, or chainmail, becomes more common. Now, mail armor is basically a mesh of interlocking iron rings. It's flexible, surprisingly effective at stopping slashing blows, and offers decent protection against piercing attacks as well. But it's also heavy, hot, and expensive. Making chainmail was a seriously time-consuming process. Each ring had to be individually forged, linked together, and then riveted shut. We're talking hundreds of hours of labor, so only the wealthier warriors, the knights and men-at-arms, could afford full mail hauberks, those long mail shirts that covered most of the body. And even then, they'd often supplement it with other defenses like a helmet, usually a simple conical or spangenhelm design, and a shield. Helmets are important, by the way. Protecting your head is generally a good idea, especially when people are trying to cave it in with axes. Early helmets were often relatively simple, but as armor evolved, so did head protection. Now, about those swords. The medieval sword is often romanticized, but the reality is a bit more practical. Early medieval swords were usually designed for cutting and slashing. They weren't super pointy for thrusting, as they mostly fought unarmored or lightly armored opponents. As armor improved, swords had to adapt, so blades became more rigid, and thrusting attacks became more important. And then there are the specialized weapons, the mace for example. A mace is basically a heavy club with a metal head, often studded with spikes or flanges. It's designed to crush armor rather than pierce it. A well-placed mace blow could break bones, concuss opponents, and generally ruin their day, even if they were wearing mail or plate. The warhammer is another nasty piece of work, similar to a mace but with a hammerhead on one side and a spike or beak on the other. The hammerhead could deliver a devastating concussive blow, while the spike could pierce armor. And let's not forget the poleaxe. This was basically an axe head mounted on a long pole, typically 4 to 6 feet long. Poleaxes were incredibly versatile weapons, capable of delivering powerful blows, piercing armor, and even tripping opponents. But the real game changer in medieval armor was the development of plate armor. We're talking full suits of articulated steel plates, custom fitted to the individual warrior. This was the ultimate in medieval personal protection. Plate armor offered unparalleled protection against almost all types of weapons. Arrows, swords, axes, they all had a much harder time penetrating well-made plate armor. And it wasn't just about defense. Plate armor was also designed to be relatively mobile. A skilled knight in a well-fitted suit of plate could move surprisingly quickly and effectively on the battlefield. But there's always a but, isn't there? Plate armor was incredibly expensive. We're talking the equivalent of several years' income for a skilled craftsman. Only the wealthiest knights and nobles could afford a full suit of plate, and even then, it was a significant investment. Moreover, plate armor wasn't foolproof. Gaps existed in the armor, particularly at the joints. Skilled fighters knew how to exploit these weaknesses, using specialized weapons like the estoc, a long, stiff, thrusting sword designed to penetrate gaps in armor, or the rondel dagger, a small needle-pointed dagger used to deliver a killing blow through the visor or armpit. And let's be honest, wearing a full suit of plate armor could be exhausting. It was heavy, it restricted your movement to some extent, and it could get incredibly hot inside. Knights in plate armor were particularly vulnerable in hot weather or during prolonged engagements. Plus, if you fell over in plate armor, you probably needed help getting up. It wasn't exactly easy to right yourself when you're encased in hundreds of pounds of steel. So plate armor wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best protection available at the time, and it had a significant impact on medieval warfare. Battles became more about maneuver and tactics, as brute force alone was often insufficient to overcome heavily armored opponents. Of course, even with the best armor, luck played a significant role in medieval combat. A stray arrow, a lucky sword thrust, a well-placed blow, any of these could spell disaster, regardless of how well protected you were. And that, my friends, is the brutal truth about medieval arms and armor. It was a constant arms race, with weapons and armor evolving in response to each other. It was about cost, effectiveness, and limitations. It was about trying to survive in a world where violence was a constant reality. So next time you see a knight in shining armor, remember that there's more to the story than just gleaming steel. There's sweat, blood, and a whole lot of money involved. Now, close your eyes and imagine the clang of steel, the thud of axes, and the soft padding of your own, much more comfortable, bed. Sleep tight. Our castles. These aren't just pretty piles of stone, are they? They're more than just romantic backdrops for fairy tales. They were the fortified hearts of medieval power, places where lords held sway and defended their lands. Settle in, let's delve into the fascinating world of castle design, construction, and strategic importance. So what is a castle? Well, at its most basic, it's a fortified residence. Think of it as a supersized, heavily armed house, designed to withstand attack. But castles weren't just about defense. They were also centers of administration, symbols of authority, and let's be honest, pretty impressive status symbols. If you were a lord in the Middle Ages, a castle was basically your way of saying, I'm important and I'm here to stay. Now, castles weren't built overnight. The earliest castles, those built not long after 1066 following the Norman conquest, were often what we call motte and bailey castles. Imagine a big mound of earth, the motte, topped with a wooden tower. Beside it, you'd have a courtyard, the bailey, enclosed by a wooden fence. These were quick to build and effective for controlling newly conquered territories. They were like the medieval equivalent of a fast food restaurant, quick, easy, and satisfying a need. However, wood burns, wood rots. Over time, these wooden structures were replaced with stone. Stone castles were much stronger, more resistant to fire and siege, and frankly, just looked more imposing. This transition marked a major shift in castle design and construction. Let's talk about some of the key features of a stone castle. First up, the walls. These weren't just thin barriers, oh no. They were thick, often several meters thick, making them incredibly difficult to breach. And they were tall too, giving defenders a commanding view of the surrounding area. Then you have the towers. These were strategically placed along the walls, providing flanking fire. Think of them as little stone pimples filled with archers ready to rain arrows down on any would-be attackers. Round towers were actually found to be preferable to square, as round ones dissipated any damage from projectiles, rather than bearing the full brunt of impact. Next, the gatehouse. This was the main entrance to the castle, and as you might expect, heavily fortified. It often included a drawbridge, a portcullis, a heavy grating that could be dropped quickly to block the entrance, and murder holes openings in the ceiling through which defenders could drop nasty things on anyone trying to break in. Gatehouses weren't just entrances, they were death traps. And of course, no castle would be complete without a keep. This was the strongest and most secure part of the castle, the last line of defense. It was where the lord and his family would retreat if the outer defenses were breached. The keep wasn't just a refuge, it was a symbol of resistance, a defiant statement that the castle would not fall easily. Building a castle was a massive undertaking. It required a huge amount of labor, skilled stonemasons, carpenters, and unskilled workers to haul materials. And those materials? Stone, timber, lime for mortar, all had to be quarried, transported, and prepared. Castles were expensive to build, and only the wealthiest lords could afford them. Building a really big one could take years, even decades to complete, which is why if the king ordered you to build one, you were pretty stuck. Now, where you put your castle was just as important as how you built it. Castles were often located on high ground, like hilltops or cliffs, giving defenders a natural advantage. They were also frequently built near rivers or other water sources, ensuring a supply of fresh water during a siege. And they were strategically placed to control important trade routes or to guard against invasion. A castle in the right place could dominate an entire region. It was all about location, 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 even in the Middle Ages. So, castles were more than just defensive structures. They were also centers of power and control. From their castles, lords administered their lands, collected taxes, and enforced their laws. They were the local bigwigs, and the castle was their headquarters. Castles also played an important role in warfare. They were used as bases for launching attacks, as strongholds for resisting enemy invasions, and as strategic points for controlling territory. A well-defended castle could tie up an entire enemy army, forcing them into a long and costly siege. Think about it. If you're an invading army, you can't just ignore a castle sitting in the middle of the territory you're trying to conquer. You either have to take it, which can be difficult and time-consuming, or you have to bypass it, leaving a fortified enemy stronghold at your back. It's a lose-lose situation, all thanks to the castle. Siege warfare. warfare. The art of attacking a castle was a major part of medieval warfare. Attackers would try to breach the castle walls using siege engines, like catapults and trebuchets, or by digging tunnels underneath the walls. Defenders would try to resist by manning the walls, launching arrows and other projectiles, and by setting traps for the attackers. Sieges could last for months, even years, testing the endurance of both attackers and defenders. It was a brutal and often slow process, a war of attrition where the winner was often the side with the most resources and the most staying power. Castles weren't just about defense, they also influenced the surrounding landscape. Villages and towns often grew up around castles, providing them with supplies and labor. These settlements were often dependent on the castle for protection, creating a symbiotic relationship between the castle and the community. The castle provided security, and the community provided support. The design of castles evolved over time as new technologies and tactics emerged. The introduction of gunpowder, for example, led to changes in castle design, with thicker walls and lower profiles becoming more common. But even with the advent of gunpowder, castles remained important defensive structures for centuries. The age of castles eventually came to an end as gunpowder weapons became more powerful and armies became more professional. But their legacy lives on in the many castles that still stand today, testaments to the ingenuity and determination of the people who built and defended them. Think about some famous castles. Caernarfon Castle in Wales, a massive, imposing structure that dominates the landscape, or the Tower of London, with its long and bloody history. These castles aren't just tourist attractions, they're tangible links to the past, reminders of a time when castles were at the center of power and conflict. So the next time you see a castle, take a moment to appreciate its history, its design, and its strategic importance. It's not just a pile of stones, it's a symbol of medieval power, a testament to human ingenuity, and a reminder of a time when warfare was a very different game. And now, let's drift off to sleep, thinking about mighty battlements against a soft, misty morning. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to descend into the surprisingly complex world of medieval siege warfare. Now, when we think of medieval battles, we often picture armies clashing on open fields, maybe a heroic knight or two cutting a swath through the enemy ranks. But the real war, the war that truly defined the era, was often fought slowly, very, very slowly. I am of course talking about sieges. Think of a siege like a medieval staring contest, but with far more rocks, starvation, and the occasional gruesome death. Castles, as we discussed in the last episode, were the linchpins of medieval power. They weren't just pretty buildings, they were fortified strongholds, symbols of authority, and critical for controlling territory. Taking one down, well, that was no easy feat, which is precisely why sieges became such a prominent feature of medieval warfare. Forget your quick, decisive battles. Sieges were about patience, resourcefulness, and a whole lot of waiting. So what exactly is a siege? At its core, a siege is a military tactic where an army surrounds a fortified position, usually a castle or a walled city, with the intent of cutting off supplies and forcing its surrender. The idea is to isolate the defenders, deplete their resources, and break their will to resist. It's a war of attrition, a test of endurance, and a logistical nightmare for everyone involved. Think of it as high-stakes camping, for months, maybe even years on end. The basic strategy of a siege is pretty straightforward, in theory. First, you surround the target. This involved encircling the castle or city to prevent anyone from getting in or out. Then you cut off their supply lines. The goal here is to stop food, water, and reinforcements from reaching the defenders. Third step, and this is where things get loud, launch an assault. Attack the walls using siege engines, mining, or direct assaults. Finally, if all else, starvation, disease, and dwindling morale are your allies here. Now, let's talk about the stars of the show, siege engines. These weren't your average battering rams, these were complex, often massive, machines designed to hurl projectiles, batter down walls, and generally make life miserable for the defenders. We're talking about seriously impressive feats of medieval engineering. First up, the battering ram. A relatively simple device, really, but incredibly effective. This was typically a large log, often reinforced with iron, swung repeatedly against a gate or wall to break it down. The ram was usually suspended from a frame on wheels and shielded from above to protect the operators from enemy fire. Picture a giant wrecking ball, medieval style. Next, we have the siege tower, also known as a belfry. These were towering wooden structures, built on wheels, that could be rolled up to the castle walls. They were often taller than the walls themselves, allowing attackers to rain arrows and missiles down on the defenders, or even storm the walls directly. Imagine a mobile staircase of doom. Now, we get to the big boys, catapults, mangonels and trebuchets. These were the artillery of the medieval world, capable of launching massive projectiles over long distances. Catapults and mangonels used torsion or tension to fling their ammunition, while trebuchets used a counterweight system for maximum power. We're talking rocks, of course, but also things like dead animals, beehives, or even, in some cases, the bodies of captured enemies. Yeah, medieval warfare could get pretty creative. The trebuchet was the king of siege engines. It used a long arm with a counterweight on one end and a sling on the other. When the counterweight dropped, it swung the arm and launched the projectile with incredible force. These things could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds for hundreds of meters, smashing walls and causing general mayhem. Seriously, if you saw one of these things being wheeled into position, you knew you were in for a bad time. And what about mining? That was a rather sneaky and very dangerous tactic. Miners would dig tunnels under the castle walls and then collapse the tunnels, causing the walls to crumble. This was slow, painstaking work and incredibly risky. The defenders would often try to countermine, digging their own tunnels to intercept the attackers. Imagine two groups of miners, toiling away in the dark, trying to collapse each other's tunnels, possibly engaging in underground combat. Claustrophobia. Anyone? Of course, the defenders weren't just going to sit around and take it. They had their own strategies for resisting a siege. First and foremost, reinforce the defenses, patch up walls, strengthen gates, clear the surrounding area to give the attackers no cover. They would also stockpile supplies before the siege began: food, water, weapons, and anything else they might need to hold out for an extended period. Then there was active defense. Defenders would rain arrows, stones, and boiling liquids, oil, water, even sewage, down on the attackers. They'd drop rocks from the walls, launch counterattacks, and generally do everything they could to disrupt the siege. Think of it as a really intense game of keep away. The defenders would also use their own artillery. Smaller catapults and ballistae could be mounted on the walls to target siege engines and enemy troops. They might also use incendiary weapons, basically flaming projectiles, to set fire to siege towers or other wooden structures. It was all about making the attackers' lives as difficult and as short as possible. Another key tactic was psychological warfare. Defenders would try to demoralize the attackers by taunting them, displaying captured banners, or even launching their own unpleasant surprises over the walls. The aim was to break the attackers' will to fight and convince them that the siege wasn't worth the effort. But let's face it, the most effective defense against a siege was simply having a well-stocked castle, a loyal garrison, and strong walls. A castle that was well prepared could hold out for months, even years, forcing the besiegers to give up and go home. So what determined the outcome of a siege? Well, it depended on a number of factors. The strength of the castle defenses, of course, the size and resources of the attacking army, the skill of the commanders on both sides. But perhaps the most important factor was time. The longer a siege dragged on, the more likely it was that the attackers would run out of supplies, lose morale, or be forced to abandon the siege due to other commitments. Sieges had a profound impact on medieval warfare. They shaped military strategy, influenced castle design, and determined the fate of countless kingdoms and territories. They were brutal, drawn-out affairs that tested the limits of human endurance. They were also arguably the most important form of warfare in the Middle Ages. So the next time you picture a medieval battle, remember that it wasn't all knights and shining armor. It was also about rocks, starvation, and the slow, agonizing grind of siege warfare. And on that rather cheerful note, perhaps it's time to dim the lights just a little bit further. Let your thoughts drift away from the trebuchets and the battering rams and settle into the quiet comfort of your bed. Think about the endless fields of wheat, the soft glow of candlelight, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. And until next time, sleep well. Alright friends, settle in a little deeper. Tonight we're trading grand strategy for the nitty-gritty. The muddy reality of medieval infantry. Forget the knights for a bit. We're talking about the backbone of most armies, the guys who did the real slogging. Now, let's drift off to the battlefield. Infantry tactics in the medieval period were, at their heart, about survival, and about maximizing effectiveness with relatively limited training. Now, we're not talking about the highly drilled legions of Rome or the disciplined infantry formations of later eras. Medieval armies were often a mix of levied peasants, professional soldiers, and everything in between. This meant commanders had to rely on relatively simple formations and tactics. Let's start with the most basic and ubiquitous, the shield wall. Imagine a line of men, shoulder to shoulder, each holding a shield that overlaps with his neighbors. This formed a, hopefully, impenetrable barrier against missile fire and enemy charges. Now, the shield wall wasn't some magical invulnerable formation. It had strengths and weaknesses. Its strength was its defensive capability. A well-formed shield wall could absorb a lot of punishment. Arrows might stick in the shields, but the men behind them were relatively safe, at least from the initial volley. A cavalry charge could be blunted, maybe even stopped outright, depending on the terrain and the quality of the troops. But here's the thing, the shield wall was slow and not very maneuverable. Once engaged, it was difficult to change direction or respond to flanking maneuvers. It was also tiring. Holding a shield up for hours on end, especially in the heat of battle, was exhausting, and a shield wall was only as strong as its weakest point. If a section of the line broke, the entire formation could collapse. Morale played a huge part too. Men who were frightened or poorly led were more likely to break ranks, creating gaps in the wall. Now what about weaponry? Well, behind the shields, men wielded a variety of weapons. Spears were common, used to poke at the enemy over or around the shields. Swords, axes, and maces were used for close quarters fighting, when the lines clashed and the battle turned into a brutal shoving match. Shield walls also weren't just a northern or Viking thing, though they are famously associated with them. Variations of shield wall tactics were used all over Europe, adapting to local conditions and available equipment. Think about the scutum formation of Roman legionaries. Similar in concept, right? Now, as time went on, infantry tactics began to evolve. The simple shield wall gave way to more complex formations, particularly as weaponry and armor improved. One important development was the increasing use of spears and pikes. Spears, as we mentioned, were already common, but now we see longer spears, sometimes up to 10 or 12 feet long, becoming more prevalent. These longer spears allowed infantry to engage cavalry more effectively, creating a sort of porcupine-like defense. Imagine a tightly packed formation of men, each holding a long spear pointed outwards. A charging horse would be faced with a wall of sharp points, making a direct attack suicidal. This type of formation became known as a spear formation or spear square. These formations needed space to function though, they worked best in open terrain. One key battle that showcased the effectiveness of the spear formation was the Battle of Courtrai in 1302. Here, a Flemish peasant army, armed primarily with long spears called Godendags, utterly defeated a force of French knights. The knights, hampered by the muddy terrain, were unable to break the Flemish lines and were slaughtered. This battle was a wake-up call, demonstrating that well-disciplined infantry could defeat even the most heavily armored cavalry, and that terrain mattered. The next step in this evolution was the development of the pike square. Now, the pike is essentially a very long spear, often 14 to 18 feet long, or even longer. Think telephone poles with pointy ends. Pike squares were incredibly effective against cavalry, creating an almost impenetrable wall of pikes. Again, picture that hedgehog of death. But pike squares were also vulnerable. They were slow to maneuver and could be easily disrupted by artillery fire or flanking attacks. They were also vulnerable to other infantry, if that infantry could get close enough. Remember, those pikes were great for keeping horses away, but not so great for fighting at close quarters. The men at the center of the square often carried shorter weapons like swords or axes for defense against infantry attacks. One of the most famous examples of pike squares in action is from the later medieval and early Renaissance period. The Swiss pikemen were renowned for their discipline and fighting prowess. They were often hired as mercenaries, and their pike squares were feared throughout Europe. They fought in tight formations, moving in unison and unleashing devastating volleys of attacks. The key to the success of pike squares was discipline and training. It took a lot of practice to move and fight effectively in such a formation. Men had to be able to maintain their position in the line, even under pressure, and they had to be able to coordinate their movements with their comrades. This required strong leadership and a high level of cohesion within the unit. So not just any group of random peasants with pikes was going to cut it. Now, let's not get too carried away with the idea of pike squares being invincible. They definitely had weaknesses. Their main vulnerability was their flanks. If an enemy could get around the sides of the square, they could wreak havoc. This meant that pike squares needed to be supported by other troops, such as archers or other infantry, to protect their flanks. Another weakness was their vulnerability to missile fire. A well-placed volley of arrows or crossbow bolts could inflict heavy casualties on a pike square, especially if the men were not wearing good armor. As gunpowder weapons became more prevalent, pike squares became increasingly vulnerable. Cannons could easily blast holes in the formation, and muskets could pick off individual pikemen at a distance. So while the pike square remained a dominant infantry tactic for a long time, it eventually became obsolete with the rise of gunpowder warfare. By the late 17th century, the pike had largely been replaced by the bayonet, which allowed infantry to combine missile fire with close quarters combat. But for a good long stretch there, pikes ruled. So from the simple shield wall to the complex pike square, medieval infantry tactics evolved over time, driven by changes in weaponry, armor, and the nature of warfare itself. These weren't glamorous tactics. It wasn't about individual heroism. It was about collective survival, about holding the line, and about working together to defeat the enemy. And that in itself is a pretty compelling story. Now, take a deep breath, and let's move on to our next topic: cavalry. Good evening, slumberers, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we're going to delve into the world of medieval cavalry. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let's gently trot into the past. Cavalry warfare in the Middle Ages. It's one of those things that immediately conjures up images of shining knights, thundering hooves, and dramatic charges. And to be fair, those images aren't entirely wrong. But as always, the reality is a bit more nuanced, a bit more boring, perhaps. But that's exactly what we need, isn't it? So let's start with the basics. What exactly is cavalry? Well, it's simply soldiers who fight on horseback. Now, horses offer a lot of advantages on the battlefield. They provide greater mobility, allowing you to move quickly to different parts of the field, to outflank the enemy, or to pursue fleeing troops. They also give you a higher vantage point, literally. This can be useful for spotting enemy movements and for directing your own troops. And of course, there's the sheer psychological impact of a large group of mounted soldiers bearing down on you. But the main thing, the thing that made cavalry such a dominant force for so much of medieval history, was the charge. The idea was simple. Get a group of heavily armored knights on powerful war horses, line them up, and then send them charging at the enemy line. The sheer weight and momentum of this charge, combined with the knights' lances and swords, could shatter enemy formations and break their morale. Now, when we talk about knights, we're generally talking about members of the medieval nobility. These were the guys who had the land, the wealth, and the time to train in the art of warfare. Becoming a knight was a long and arduous process, starting in boyhood with training as a page and then a squire. They learned to ride, to fight with various weapons, and to maintain their armor. It was expensive too. A good warhorse, a suit of armor, and all the associated equipment could cost a small fortune. So knights were essentially the elite, the professional soldiers of the medieval world. Their armor evolved over time, starting with chainmail and gradually progressing to plate armor. Plate armor offered much better protection, covering almost the entire body in overlapping steel plates. But it was also incredibly expensive and heavy, which meant that only the wealthiest knights could afford it, and it also meant that they needed strong, well-bred horses to carry them. These war horses, often called destriers, were specifically bred for warfare. They were larger and more muscular than regular riding horses, capable of carrying a heavily armored knight and withstanding the rigors of battle. And they were trained to be aggressive and fearless, charging head-on into enemy formations. Okay, so we have our heavily armored knights on their powerful war horses. They line up, lower their lances, and charge. Sounds unstoppable, right? Well, not quite. The medieval cavalry charge, for all its power, had its limitations. One of the biggest limitations was terrain. A cavalry charge needed relatively flat, open ground to be effective. If the ground was too uneven, too muddy, or too covered with obstacles, the charge could be disrupted, and the knights could be thrown from their horses. Think about it. A horse can't charge effectively through a forest, or up a steep hill, or across a bog. So the terrain played a huge role in determining whether a cavalry charge was even possible. Another limitation was the enemy formation. A well-disciplined infantry formation, especially one armed with long spears or pikes, could pose a serious threat to charging cavalry. These spears could be used to unhorse the knights, or even to kill the horses outright. Think of a porcupine, all bristling with sharp quills. A charging knight facing a wall of spears could find himself in a very sticky situation. One of the most famous examples of this is the Battle of Courtrai in 1302. There, a force of Flemish infantry, armed with pikes, completely routed a force of French knights. The knights charged, but they were unable to break the Flemish formation, and many were pulled from their horses and killed. The battle became known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs because so many knights' spurs were collected from the battlefield, and even if a cavalry charge did break through the enemy line, it wasn't necessarily the end of the battle. The knights might find themselves surrounded by enemy soldiers, vulnerable to attack from all sides. And of course, once a knight was unhorsed, he was at a significant disadvantage. His heavy armor made it difficult to move quickly, and he could be easily overwhelmed by enemy infantry. So cavalry wasn't some kind of unstoppable force. It was just one element of a medieval army, and its effectiveness depended on a variety of factors. And crucially, cavalry needed the support of infantry to be truly effective. Infantry could screen the cavalry from enemy attacks, protect their flanks, and exploit any breakthroughs that the cavalry created. And cavalry in turn could provide mobile firepower and shock troops to support the infantry. It was a symbiotic relationship. Think of the famous battles of the 100 Years' War, like Crécy and Agincourt. The English armies in those battles relied heavily on a combination of longbowmen and dismounted knights. The longbowmen would rain arrows down on the French knights, disrupting their formations and weakening their attacks. And then, the dismounted knights would fight alongside the infantry, providing a solid core of heavily armored troops. And it's important to remember that not all cavalry were knights. There were also lighter, more mobile forms of cavalry, often used for scouting, skirmishing, and pursuing fleeing enemies. These lighter cavalrymen might not have worn full plate armor, but they were often armed with bows, javelins, or light spears. They were the eyes and ears of the army, and they played a vital role in gathering intelligence and harassing the enemy. Also, let's not forget about the horses themselves. War horses were valuable and difficult to replace. They needed to be fed, watered, and cared for, and they were vulnerable to disease and injury. A large army could require vast amounts of fodder to feed its horses, which could place a significant strain on the local resources. Furthermore, the charge wasn't the only tactic available to medieval cavalry. They could also be used for flanking maneuvers, encircling the enemy, or providing a mobile reserve. And in some cases, they could even be used as mounted archers, firing arrows from horseback. Remember, warfare isn't just about brute force, it's also about strategy, tactics, and logistics. And the successful medieval commander was the one who could combine all these elements effectively, using his cavalry, infantry, and other troops in a coordinated and complementary way. So the next time you picture a medieval battle, don't just imagine those shining knights charging across the field. Think about the muddy ground, the bristling spears, the archers raining down arrows, and the countless other factors that determined the outcome of the battle. Think about the complex interplay between different types of troops, the challenges of logistics and supply, and the skill and leadership required to command an army in the field. Because medieval warfare, like all warfare, was a messy, complex, and often brutal business, and it's only by understanding its complexities that we can truly appreciate its history. Now, let's just rest here for a moment, and let those images of the medieval knights fade slowly away. Let's not rush into sleep. And next time, we'll be looking at naval warfare. Sweet dreams. Alright friends, settle in because it's time to set sail on the tranquil seas of medieval naval warfare. Now, I know what you're thinking, ships and battles seems a bit rowdy for bedtime, doesn't it? But trust me, we're going to explore this topic in a slow, soothing way, focusing on the creak of the timbers, the gentle sway of the waves, and the sometimes less than gentle clash of wooden hulls. Just imagine yourself drifting along with the tide. So, what kind of ships are we talking about? Well, there wasn't exactly a standardized navy like you might imagine today. Instead, medieval naval power relied on a patchwork of different ship types, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. In the earlier medieval period, the longship reigned supreme, particularly in northern Europe. You know, those iconic Viking vessels? Long, narrow, and shallow drafted, they were perfect for raiding coastal settlements and navigating rivers. They weren't just good for raiding either, they were extremely versatile. These ships would be used for trade in times of peace, and swiftly converted to carry warriors when needed. Think of it like a very aggressive multi-purpose vehicle. They relied on both sails and oars, so they could travel long distances and maneuver quickly in battle. Plus, their shallow draft meant they could be beached easily, allowing Viking warriors to disembark and, well, do what Vikings do best. As we move later into the medieval period, and especially in the Mediterranean, we see the rise of the galley. These ships were longer and lower to the water than longships, and they were primarily powered by oars. Think of them like floating battering rams. They were sleek, fast, and designed for one thing, ramming other ships. Now, I know ramming sounds a bit abrupt for a sleep aid, but picture the scene, the gentle rocking of the galley, the rhythmic creak of the oars as the rowers pull in unison, the quiet determination on the captain's face as he lines up his target. See, sleepy. Of course, there were other ship types too. Cogs, for example, were rounder and broader than galleys, making them more stable and better suited for carrying cargo. They were the workhorses of medieval trade, transporting goods like wool, wine, and timber across the seas. Think of them as the long-haul trucks of the medieval world. They were powered primarily by sails, making them slower but more efficient for long journeys. Over time, these would be modified into the larger carracks and knors that would dominate the seas later on. So, now that we know about the ships, what about the tactics? How did these medieval sailors actually fight each other? Well, naval warfare in the Middle Ages was a pretty brutal affair. It wasn't like the Age of Sail where ships lined up and exchanged broadsides. Instead, it was much more close and personal. The primary tactics revolved around two things: ramming and boarding. Ramming, as you might guess, involved smashing your ship into another ship with the goal of sinking it, or at least disabling it. This was often done with galleys, which were specifically designed for this purpose. The idea was to create a hole in the enemy ship's hull, causing it to take on water and eventually sink. A well-executed ram could be devastating, ending a battle very quickly. But ramming wasn't always possible, or even desirable. Sometimes it was better to board the enemy ship and fight hand to hand. This is where things got really messy. Imagine two ships locked together, sailors and soldiers clambering onto each other's decks, swinging swords, axes, and whatever else they could get their hands on. It was essentially a land battle at sea, and it was often incredibly bloody. Archers and crossbowmen would often be stationed on the decks or in the masts, raining down arrows and bolts on the enemy. This could soften up the opposing crew before the boarding action began, and sometimes they'd even use, wait for it, Greek fire. This was a highly flammable substance that was incredibly difficult to extinguish. It could be launched from flamethrowers or catapults, setting enemy ships ablaze. Now, I know fire sounds a bit exciting, but imagine the scene: the gentle flicker of the flames, the crackling sound as they consume the wooden ship, the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've turned your enemy's vessel into a floating bonfire. See? Still sleepy. It's like a campfire, but a little bit more maritime. Other common tactics included trying to grapple enemy ships together to prevent them from maneuvering, or using grappling hooks to pull down their sails or rigging. Basically anything to gain an advantage in the chaotic melee. Now, all of this might sound a bit disorganized, and well, it often was. Medieval naval battles were rarely decisive affairs. They were often more about attrition, wearing down the enemy's resources and manpower over time. So why was all this naval warfare so important anyway? Why did medieval rulers invest so much time and effort into building and maintaining fleets of ships? Well, the answer is simple. Control of the seas meant control of trade and military transport. Think about it. In the Middle Ages, land travel was slow, expensive, and dangerous. Roads were often poorly maintained. Bandits roamed the countryside, and transporting large quantities of goods was a major logistical challenge. Sea travel, on the other hand, was much more efficient. Ships could carry far more cargo than wagons, and they could travel much faster. This made sea lanes vital for trade. Controlling these sea lanes meant controlling the flow of goods, and that meant controlling the economy. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew rich and powerful by dominating maritime trade in the Mediterranean. They built massive fleets of ships, not just for warfare but also for commerce. These ships transported spices from the East, silk from China, and all sorts of other valuable goods to Europe. But naval power wasn't just about trade, it was also essential for military transport. Armies needed to be moved from place to place, and ships were the most efficient way to do it. Think about the Crusades. European armies had to be transported across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land, and that required a massive naval effort. Controlling the sea lanes meant controlling the ability to project military power. You couldn't launch an invasion, supply a besieged city, or reinforce a distant garrison without a strong navy. Controlling the seas. And controlling the seas meant controlling trade and military transport. It was a vital component of medieval power, and it played a crucial role in shaping the course of history. Now, as you drift off to sleep, imagine yourself on the deck of a medieval cog, sailing through calm waters. The sun is setting, the sky is a blaze of colours, and the only sound is the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull. You feel the sway of the boat, and that soft rocking is lulling you deeper, deeper. The air smells of salt and brine, a little bit of wood and rope, very gently swaying. Your muscles relax, the tension melts from your shoulders. You're a part of this gentle rhythm, of the ship and the waves, sailing away from your worries, sailing towards that peaceful place where sleep awaits. Good night, friends. Pleasant dreams. All right, friends, let's gently shift our focus now to the role of archery in medieval warfare. It's a topic that often brings to mind images of heroic archers and volleys of arrows darkening the sky. But as always, the reality is a bit more nuanced and, well, brutal. So snuggle in and let's explore the longbow, the crossbow, and the impact they had on the medieval battlefield. Archery, of course, is ancient. Bows and arrows predate recorded history by millennia, but their specific application in medieval warfare evolved significantly over time. Early medieval armies often relied on archers, but they weren't always the most decisive force. Think of it more as a supporting role, harassment, perhaps some light skirmishing. They certainly had their place, but things would change, especially with the rise of two key weapons, the English longbow and the crossbow. Let's start with the English longbow. This weapon is practically synonymous with medieval England, especially its victories during the 100 Years' War. But what exactly made the longbow so special? Well, first there's its size. We're talking about a bow typically 6 feet long, sometimes even longer, crafted from a single stave of yew wood. Now, yew wood is crucial here. It has a unique combination of properties: a tough, elastic heartwood that can store a lot of energy, and a flexible sapwood that prevents the bow from breaking. Finding good yew was actually a constant concern for English monarchs. They even mandated the import of yew staves, because without the yew you don't have your longbow. But the bow itself is only part of the story. The real power of the longbow came from the archers themselves. These weren't just random peasants grabbed off the street and handed a bow. They were highly trained individuals, often starting their training from a young age. Imagine years of practice building up the strength and stamina needed to draw a bow with a draw weight often exceeding 100 pounds. That's like lifting, well, a really heavy weight every single time you want to fire an arrow. Think about the physical demands. Drawing that bow required incredible back and arm strength, and holding that draw for any length of time, exhausting. These archers developed specialized muscles and a deep understanding of their weapon. They knew how to adjust for wind, range, and even the movement of their target, and they could fire rapidly. Skilled longbowmen could loose perhaps 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Imagine that hail of arrows raining down on you. Now, what about those arrows? Longbow arrows weren't just simple sticks with feathers. They were carefully constructed projectiles, usually around 30 inches long, with a steel or iron arrowhead. Different arrowhead shapes served different purposes. Bodkin points for piercing armor, broadheads for causing maximum damage to unarmored targets, and so on. These arrows could travel considerable distances, perhaps 250 to 300 yards, and they packed a serious punch. But here's where we get to the impact on armored opponents. The longbow's effectiveness against armor is a topic of much debate. A well-aimed arrow fired from close range could penetrate certain types of armor, especially the weaker points, the joints, the visor of a helmet, or the thinner plates on the back and sides. Bodkin points, specifically designed for armor piercing, were most effective against mail or thinner plate armor. However, a fully armored knight in high-quality plate armor was a much tougher nut to crack. A longbow arrow might dent the armor, injure the knight underneath, or even knock him off his horse, but it wasn't always a guaranteed kill shot. Still, even if the arrow didn't penetrate, the sheer force of the impact could be enough to cause serious blunt trauma. The real advantage of the longbow wasn't necessarily its ability to punch through armor, but its rate of fire and its ability to deliver a large volume of arrows onto the battlefield. A massed volley of longbow arrows could disrupt enemy formations, thin their ranks, and create chaos. Imagine hundreds, even thousands of arrows raining down on you. Even if most of them bounced off your armor, a few would find their mark, and the sheer psychological impact of being under that kind of fire would be terrifying. And that's where the strategic impact came in. Battles like Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt during the 100 Years' War demonstrated the devastating potential of the English longbow. The English often deployed their longbowmen on the flanks, protected by stakes or other obstacles to prevent cavalry charges. The archers would then unleash volleys of arrows into the advancing French knights, disrupting their formations and making them vulnerable to the English infantry. The muddy ground at Agincourt further hampered the French, making them easy targets for the English archers. These victories cemented the longbow's reputation as a game-changing weapon and helped establish English military dominance for a time. Okay, let's take a deep breath. That's a lot about the longbow. Now let's shift our attention to its rival, the crossbow. The crossbow was another significant archery weapon in medieval warfare, but it had some key differences compared to the longbow. The crossbow, at its heart, is a bow mounted horizontally on a stock, with a mechanism to hold the string drawn back and a trigger to release it. This design offered several advantages. First, it required less physical strength to operate. You didn't need years of training to build up the muscles needed to draw a crossbow. A winding mechanism, like a crank or a lever, did the work for you. This meant that crossbowmen could be trained relatively quickly, and you could field more of them more easily. Second, the crossbow allowed for greater accuracy. Because the crossbowmen didn't have to hold the draw manually, they could take more time to aim. The stock also provided a more stable platform, further enhancing accuracy. Third, crossbows could generate immense power. Some crossbows, especially those with steel limbs, could produce bolts that had significantly more kinetic energy than longbow arrows. These bolts were shorter and stouter than longbow arrows, and they were often fitted with armor-piercing points. However, the crossbow also had its drawbacks. The biggest one was its slow rate of fire. Winding the crossbow after each shot took time, significantly more time than nocking and drawing a longbow. A skilled crossbowman might be able to fire only 1 or 2 bolts per minute, compared to the longbowman's 10 to 12 arrows. This slow rate of fire made crossbowmen vulnerable in open combat. They needed protection from enemy infantry and cavalry while they reloaded. This is why crossbowmen were often deployed behind pavisas, large shields that provided cover while they wound their weapons. Now let's talk about the impact of crossbows on armored opponents. Crossbow bolts, especially those fired from powerful steel crossbows, were indeed effective against armor. A well-aimed bolt could penetrate even high-quality plate armor at close range. The armor-piercing points were designed to concentrate the force of the impact on a small area, allowing them to punch through the metal. However, like the longbow, the crossbow wasn't a magic bullet against armor. A skilled armorer could design armor that was resistant to crossbow bolts, and the effectiveness of the crossbow depended on the range, the quality of the crossbow, and the skill of the crossbowman. Despite its slower rate of fire, the crossbow played a significant role in medieval warfare. It was particularly effective in siege warfare, where its accuracy and power could be used to target defenders on the walls or to pick off enemy archers. Crossbows were also used extensively by mercenaries, who valued their ease of use and their ability to inflict serious damage. So which weapon was better, the longbow or the crossbow? Well, it depends on the situation. The longbow had a higher rate of fire and was more effective at delivering a large volume of arrows onto the battlefield. The crossbow was more accurate, more powerful, and required less training. Ultimately, both weapons had their strengths and weaknesses, and they both played a significant role in shaping the course of medieval warfare. And that, friends, is a brief look at the role of archery in medieval warfare. From the mighty longbow to the powerful crossbow, these weapons transformed the battlefield and influenced the course of history. Now let's close our eyes and imagine the sound of those arrows whistling through the air, or perhaps not. Perhaps that's a little too exciting for bedtime. Instead, let's simply drift off to sleep, knowing that we've learned a little something about the realities of medieval combat. Alright, settle in, friend, and let's gently unpack the influence of the church on warfare during the medieval period. I know, it might sound a bit contradictory, but trust me, it's a fascinating intersection of faith, power, and more war. The church, you see, wasn't just a collection of pious monks quietly illuminating manuscripts. It was a major player in the medieval world, wielding enormous political, economic, and social influence. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a powerful multinational corporation, but with God as the CEO. And like any powerful institution, the church had to grapple with the messy realities of war. Now, Christianity, at its core, preaches peace and love, turn the other cheek, that sort of thing. But let's be honest, turning the other cheek wasn't exactly a winning strategy when faced with a bunch of Vikings wielding axes, or rival lords eyeing your territory. So the church had to find a way to reconcile its pacifist ideals with the very real need for self-defense, and even at times expansion. Enter the just war theory. This wasn't some sudden revelation, but rather a gradual development of ideas, building upon the writings of early church fathers like St. Augustine. The basic idea was to create a set of criteria that had to be met in order for a war to be considered morally justifiable. Think of it as the church's attempt to put some guardrails on the otherwise chaotic and brutal business of warfare. So what were these criteria? Well, first and foremost, a war had to be declared by a legitimate authority. This meant a king, a prince, or someone with the recognized power to make such a decision. No rogue knights going off on their own personal crusades, at least not officially. Secondly, there had to be a just cause for the war. This could include defending oneself or others from aggression, righting a wrong, or recovering stolen property. But it couldn't be simply about greed, ambition, or a desire for conquest. Sorry, aspiring emperors, those motivations just weren't going to cut it. Thirdly, the war had to be waged with the right intention. Even if there was a just cause, the goal couldn't be simply to inflict pain and suffering. The intention had to be to achieve peace and restore order. And finally, a war had to be a last resort. All other peaceful means of resolving the conflict, diplomacy, negotiation, arbitration, had to be exhausted before resorting to violence. War was seen as a necessary evil, not something to be entered into lightly. Now it's important to remember that these were ideals. The reality on the ground was often far messier. Medieval rulers were masters of spin, and they could often find ways to justify their wars, no matter how dubious the cause. And even when the criteria were genuinely met, the actual conduct of war was often far from just. Medieval warfare was, after all, a brutal business. But the just war theory did have a significant impact. It provided a framework for moral debate, and it helped to restrain some of the worst excesses of warfare. It also gave the church a powerful tool to influence the behavior of rulers. A king who consistently violated the principles of just war theory risked excommunication, which in the medieval world was a pretty serious threat. It meant being cut off from the sacraments and potentially losing the loyalty of your subjects. Not exactly conducive to a long and prosperous reign. Now let's turn our attention to another, perhaps even more impactful, aspect of the Church's involvement in warfare. Holy wars. These were wars motivated by religious fervor, often with the stated goal of defending or expanding the Christian faith. And the most famous example of this, of course, is the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of military campaigns, primarily in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, aimed at wresting control of the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, from Muslim control. They were fueled by a complex mix of religious zeal, political ambition, and economic opportunity, and they were actively promoted by the Church, which offered spiritual rewards, like indulgences, which were essentially pardons for sins, to those who participated. The call to crusade resonated deeply with many people in medieval Europe. The idea of fighting for God, of reclaiming the land where Jesus had lived and died, was incredibly powerful, and it wasn't just knights and nobles who answered the call. Peasants, merchants, even women and children joined the ranks of the Crusaders. Now, the Crusades were incredibly complex and multifaceted events, and we'll delve into them in more detail later. But for now, it's important to understand the role that religious fervor played in motivating these campaigns. The Church provided the ideological framework, the spiritual justification, and the organizational structure that made the Crusades possible. But the Crusades weren't the only example of holy wars in the medieval period. There were also the Reconquista in Spain, where Christian kingdoms gradually pushed back against Muslim rule, and the Northern Crusades, aimed at converting pagan populations in the Baltic region to Christianity. These holy wars were often characterized by intense religious violence and intolerance. The idea that God was on your side could be a powerful motivator, but it could also lead to atrocities committed in the name of faith. And of course, these conflicts often had devastating consequences for both Christian and non-Christian societies. It's also important to note that religious fervor wasn't always the primary motivator in medieval warfare. Often religious justifications were used to mask more practical concerns, like land acquisition, political power, or economic gain. But the fact that religious justifications were so often invoked speaks to the immense influence of the Church in medieval society. The Church's involvement in warfare wasn't limited to just the just war theory and holy wars. It also played a role in promoting certain codes of conduct on the battlefield. The concept of chivalry, for example, which emphasized honor, courtesy, and bravery, was heavily influenced by Christian ideals. Knights were expected to protect the weak, defend the Church, and treat their opponents with respect, at least in theory. Now again, the reality often fell short of the ideal. But the Church's promotion of chivalric values did have a moderating influence on the conduct of warfare. It helped to establish certain norms of behavior, and it provided a framework for judging the actions of soldiers. The Church also played a role in providing spiritual support to soldiers. Chaplains accompanied armies on campaign, offering prayers, administering sacraments, and providing comfort to the wounded and dying. Religious symbols, like crosses and banners, were often carried into battle, serving as rallying points and sources of inspiration. And of course, the Church was a major landowner and a significant economic power. It often provided financial support to rulers in times of war, and it could also raise its own armies to defend its territories. So as you can see, the Church was deeply intertwined with the world of medieval warfare. It provided moral guidelines, spiritual justification, and practical support to those engaged in conflict. Its influence was complex and multifaceted, sometimes promoting peace, sometimes fueling violence, but always shaping the course of medieval history. Now, before we drift off completely, let's just take a moment to reflect on the inherent tension between the Church's message of peace and its involvement in warfare. It's a paradox that has challenged Christians for centuries. How can a religion that preaches love and forgiveness justify violence and war? There's no easy answer, of course, but perhaps the just war theory, despite its limitations, represents a sincere attempt to grapple with this dilemma, to find a way to reconcile faith and reason, to minimize suffering, and to promote peace, even in the midst of conflict. And perhaps the Holy Wars, despite their often horrific consequences, reflect a deep-seated human desire to fight for what one believes in, to defend one's faith, and to create a better world as flawed as that vision may be. Whatever your own conclusions, it's clear that the Church's influence on medieval warfare was profound and lasting, and understanding that influence is essential to understanding the complexities of the medieval world. Alright friend, I think that's probably enough about the Church and warfare for one night. Let the ideas settle, let your mind drift, and allow yourself to gently slip into sleep. We'll continue our exploration of medieval warfare next time, when we delve into the fascinating world of the Crusades. Sleep tight. Alright, settle in friends, because tonight we're diving into a period of history fueled by intense beliefs, and well, some pretty intense military actions. We're talking about the Crusades. Now before you drift off completely, let's be clear, the word Crusades probably conjures up images of valiant knights, shining armor, and holy quests. And while elements of that are true, the full story is much more complicated, and a lot less romantic. Think religious zeal, clashing with political ambitions, cultural misunderstandings leading to horrific violence, and a whole lot of unintended consequences that rippled through centuries. So what exactly were the Crusades? Simply put, they were a series of religious wars, primarily initiated by Latin Christians in the medieval period, specifically to recover Christian holy lands in the Middle East, most famously Jerusalem, from Islamic rule. The traditional starting point is 1095, when Pope Urban II delivered a rousing speech in Clermont, France. He called on Christians to take up arms and liberate the Holy Land. This kicked off the First Crusade, which against all odds was actually fairly successful for the Crusaders. But to really understand the Crusades, we need to understand the context. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of the Roman Empire, was under increasing pressure from the Seljuk Turks, who were expanding their territory in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos appealed to the West for military assistance. Now, Pope Urban II saw an opportunity. He could potentially reunite the Eastern and Western Christian churches, which had been formally split in the Great Schism of 1054. He could also channel the martial energy of the European nobility outwards, preventing them from fighting amongst themselves so often. And of course there was the genuine religious fervor, the desire to protect Christian pilgrims and reclaim the Holy Land. Urban's speech at Clermont was incredibly effective. He spoke of the suffering of Christians in the East, the desecration of holy sites, and the promise of spiritual rewards for those who took up the cross. He offered remission of sins for anyone who died on the crusade, basically a get-out-of-jail-free card for any earthly sins. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life, from powerful nobles to humble peasants, pledged to join the cause. The motivations were varied. Some were genuinely driven by religious zeal. Others were looking for adventure, land, or wealth. Some were simply swept up in the fervor of the moment. And let's be honest, for some it was probably a welcome escape from a difficult life. The First Crusade was a truly remarkable undertaking. Imagine thousands of people, many of whom had never traveled more than a few miles from their homes, marching across Europe and into the Middle East. They faced incredible hardships along the way: hunger, disease, and constant attacks. They were poorly supplied and often relied on plunder to survive. When they finally arrived in the Holy Land, they faced well-defended cities and determined Muslim armies. But driven by their religious fervor and a fair amount of luck, the Crusaders managed to capture several key cities, including Antioch, and most importantly, Jerusalem in 1099. The capture of Jerusalem was, well, it was brutal. The Crusaders massacred much of the city's population, including Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians. Accounts from the time describe scenes of unimaginable violence. It's a stark reminder that religious zeal can be a dangerous thing, especially when combined with military power. Following the First Crusade, the Crusaders established several Crusader states in the Levant, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These states were constantly at war with their Muslim neighbors, and their survival depended on a constant influx of men and resources from Europe. Over the next 2 centuries, there were several more major crusades, each with its own aims and outcomes. The Second Crusade, in the mid-12th century, was launched in response to the fall of Edessa to the Muslims. It was a complete failure. The Third Crusade, at the end of the 12th century, was perhaps the most famous. It was prompted by the recapture of Jerusalem by Saladin, the Muslim ruler of Egypt and Syria. This crusade involved some of the most famous figures of the medieval period: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. While they didn't recapture Jerusalem, they did manage to secure some coastal territories and negotiate access for Christian pilgrims. But it's not all grand battles and famous kings. The Fourth Crusade, at the beginning of the 13th century, is where things really start to go off the rails. Originally intended to attack Egypt, the crusade was diverted to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders, motivated by a combination of political intrigue and greed, sacked the city in 1204, causing immense destruction and looting. This event permanently weakened the Byzantine Empire, contributing to its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. It also deepened the schism between the Eastern and Western Christian churches. So much for religious unity. Now I want you to really grasp this. Fellow Christians attacked a fellow Christian city and then decided to ransack it. It gets to the point where it's very difficult to claim there's any real religious justification behind it. Beyond these major crusades, there were numerous smaller crusades, some of which were directed against heretics within Europe itself. The Albigensian Crusade, for example, was launched against the Cathars, a religious group in southern France. The Children's Crusade of 1212 is a particularly tragic episode. Inspired by religious fervor, thousands of children from France and Germany set out to peacefully convert the Muslims of the Holy Land. Of course, it was a complete disaster. Many died of starvation or disease. Others were sold into slavery. The Crusades had a profound impact on both Christian and Muslim societies. They stimulated trade between Europe and the Middle East. They led to the exchange of ideas and technologies, and they contributed to the development of military tactics and fortifications. However, they also left a legacy of bitterness and distrust. The Crusades were often characterized by extreme violence and cruelty, and they deepened the divisions between Christians and Muslims. In the Muslim world, the Crusades were initially seen as a relatively minor threat, but over time they came to be viewed as a symbol of Western aggression and imperialism. This perception continues to influence relations between the West and the Muslim world today. In Europe, the Crusades contributed to the growth of papal power and the development of a sense of European identity. They also helped to justify the persecution of religious minorities, such as Jews. So what's the brutal truth about the Crusades? Well, it's that they were a complex and often contradictory phenomenon. They were driven by religious zeal, but also by political ambition, economic greed, and cultural misunderstandings. They led to both positive and negative consequences, and they left a lasting legacy that continues to shape the world today. The Crusades weren't a simple story of good versus evil. It was a messy, complicated, and often brutal period of history. Hopefully, this helps you to understand a bit more about what it was all about. And maybe, just maybe, it'll help you drift off to sleep a little easier tonight. Alright, let's drift back now, shall we? Settle in, make sure you're comfy, This time, we're peering into the murky fog of the 100 Years' War. Now don't let that name fool you, my friends, because this wasn't exactly 100 years, more like a century and a bit. We're talking from 1337 to 1453. A long nap time, wouldn't you say? So England and France, two heavyweights of medieval Europe, duking it out for, well, a lot of reasons. First off, there was the question of the French throne. See, the English kings thought they had a pretty good claim. Edward III of England, in particular, was feeling quite entitled. It all stemmed from his mother, Isabella, who was a French princess. When the French Capetian dynasty sputtered out, Edward figured he was next in line. The French, understandably, weren't thrilled about the idea of an English king ruling them, so they found a distant cousin, Philip VI, to take the crown instead. Talk about awkward family reunions. Then there was the matter of Aquitaine. England controlled this large chunk of southwestern France, and the French kings wanted it back. It was a constant source of friction, like that one slightly too loud neighbor you can never quite get away from. The English relied on the income and resources of Aquitaine, and it gave them a nice foothold on the continent. The French saw it as rightfully theirs, a tug of war with very real swords, if you catch my drift. And let's not forget the wool trade. England produced a lot of wool, and Flanders, modern-day Belgium, needed it to make cloth. Flanders, though, was technically part of France, so England and France kept interfering with each other's economic interests. It was like two kids fighting over the same box of crayons. Alright, enough about the why. Let's get to the pow. The 100 Years' War saw some major battles that shaped the course of history. And honestly, battles that were probably terrifying and, well, boring, if you were just a regular soldier stuck in the mud. First up, we have Crécy in 1346. Picture this, a vast open field, the sun glinting off armor, and a whole lot of mud. The English, led by Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, nicknamed that not for being Goth, but for the color of his armor, were outnumbered. The French army was bigger, fancier, and probably smelled a bit better. But the English had a secret weapon. You guessed it, the longbow. Now the longbow wasn't exactly new, but the English had perfected its use. These weren't your dainty little bows. We're talking about 6-foot-long weapons made of yew, requiring immense strength to draw. An English longbowman could loose off about 10 to 12 arrows a minute, and those arrows could pierce armor at a considerable distance. The French, relying on crossbows and heavily armored knights, were basically sitting ducks. Wave after wave of French knights charged into the English lines, only to be cut down by a hail of arrows. It was, well, a massacre. A muddy, feathered, and very loud massacre. The English won decisively, proving the devastating power of the longbow and exposing the limitations of traditional cavalry tactics. Fast forward to 1415, we're at Agincourt. Again, picture a muddy field. This time it had been raining, making the ground even more of a quagmire. The English, now led by Henry V, were once again outnumbered, and frankly, in a pretty desperate situation. They were deep in French territory, low on supplies, and facing a much larger French army. The French, remembering Crécy, had a plan. They would use their superior numbers to overwhelm the English, relying on their armored knights and crossbowmen. But the mud, oh the mud, the French knights, weighed down by their armor, struggled to move in the thick mud. They were sitting targets for the English longbowmen, and Henry V, he wasn't just sitting back either. He ordered his archers to use pointed stakes to create a defensive line, protecting them from cavalry charges. The English archers fired volley after volley, turning the battlefield into a killing field. The narrow field further hampered the French, bunching them together and making them even easier targets. The result, another resounding English victory. Agincourt became legendary, a testament to English archery and Henry V's tactical brilliance. Also, a testament to the importance of not fighting in the mud if you're wearing heavy armor. These battles weren't just about brute force, they highlighted the impact of new technologies and tactics. The longbow, as we've discussed, was a game changer. It allowed the English to inflict massive casualties at a distance, negating the French advantage in numbers and armor. But it wasn't just the longbow. English tactics, like the use of dismounted knights fighting alongside the archers, proved highly effective. They created a flexible, adaptable army that could respond to changing battlefield conditions. The French, for their part, weren't exactly dummies. They eventually learned to adapt too. They started using more cannons, which, though still primitive, could batter down castle walls and disrupt enemy formations. They also began to rely more on professional soldiers, rather than feudal levies, and perhaps most importantly, they found a leader who could inspire them. Joan of Arc. Now Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed to be guided by divine voices, rallied the French troops and led them to several key victories. She lifted the siege of Orléans, a major turning point in the war. Joan of Arc, she was a breath of fresh air, a fearless leader, a symbol of French resistance. Of course, her story ends tragically. She was captured by the English and their Burgundian allies, accused of heresy, and burned at the stake in 1431. But her spirit lived on, and she became a national heroine of France. Alright, so what were the consequences of all this fighting? Well, first off, a whole lot of death and destruction. The 100 Years' War devastated France. Fields were burned, villages were looted, and the population suffered immensely. England also took a hit, both financially and in terms of manpower. The war also had a profound impact on the development of both England and France as nations. In England, the war helped to strengthen the power of Parliament. The kings needed money to fund the war, so they had to ask Parliament for approval, giving Parliament more influence over government policy. It fostered a sense of national identity, a feeling that they were all in this together, whether they liked it or not. In France, the war helped to solidify the power of the monarchy. The French kings needed to raise armies and taxes to fight the English, giving them more control over the country. A sense of French national identity also grew, fueled by figures like Joan of Arc. It's a feeling they were willing to spill blood for. By 1453, the English were exhausted and financially drained. They had lost nearly all of their territories in France, except for Calais. The French, inspired by Joan of Arc, and benefiting from a revitalized economy, finally managed to drive the English out. The 100 Years' War was over, and everyone was, well, pretty tired. The war also led to significant military innovations. The rise of gunpowder weapons such as cannons and handguns began to change the face of warfare. The longbow, while still effective, was eventually replaced by firearms, and the importance of heavily armored knights diminished as infantry tactics and weapons improved. Medieval warfare was slowly giving way to something new, something, well, modern. So, there you have it. The 100 Years' War. A long, brutal, and ultimately transformative conflict that shaped the destinies of England and France. It was a war of kings and knights, of longbows and cannons, of mud and blood. It was a war that left a lasting mark on the history of Europe. Now, isn't that just sleep-inducing? Alright, settle in, history buffs. Let's drift back to the muddied battlefields and shadowy castles of England, shall we? Tonight, we're softly landing in the middle of a particularly prickly family squabble, the Wars of the Roses. Breathe in and out. Good. Now imagine England, middle of the 15th century, the crown feels unstable, like a wobbly tooth you can't stop fiddling with. For over 30 years, from 1455 to 1487, two powerful families, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, hacked, stabbed, and schemed their way through a series of battles and betrayals, all for the ultimate prize, the throne of England. Now, before you start picturing dainty tea parties with thorny flower arrangements, let's be clear, this was brutal. This was medieval power politics at its most cutthroat. Think Game of Thrones, but with fewer dragons and more English weather. So, who were these warring roses anyway? Let's start with the Lancasters. They were represented by a red rose, hence the name. They claimed their right to the throne through John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III. Their key figure at the start of the wars was King Henry VI. Well, let's just say he wasn't exactly a natural-born leader. Kind, pious, perhaps a little too fond of religious contemplation, but definitely not cut out for the rough and tumble of medieval kingship. He suffered periods of mental instability, which, predictably, didn't help. On the other side we have the House of York, symbolized by a white rose. Their claim stemmed from Edward III's other sons, and they felt Henry VI was inadequate. Their initial champion was Richard, Duke of York, a powerful nobleman who frankly thought he'd do a much better job running the country, and he wasn't shy about letting people know it. Richard wasn't just ambitious, he was also a skilled military commander and a shrewd politician. He was the kind of guy who made things happen, whether you liked it or not. The Wars of the Roses weren't one long continuous battle. Think of it more like a series of flare-ups, periods of intense fighting followed by uneasy truces, plots, and whispered conspiracies. The opening act kicked off in 1455 at the First Battle of St. Albans. Richard, Duke of York, and his allies clashed with Henry VI's forces. It was a relatively small battle, but it was significant. It was the first blood drawn in this long and bitter feud. The Yorkists won, capturing Henry VI and setting the stage for Richard's influence over the government. For a while things simmered. Richard was appointed protector of the realm during one of Henry VI's episodes, giving him near-regal power. But the Lancastrian nobles weren't happy with this Yorkist takeover. Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife, a strong-willed and fiercely protective woman, emerged as the driving force behind the Lancastrian resistance. She wasn't about to let some upstart duke steal her son's birthright. And here's where things get really interesting. Margaret, she was a force of nature, driven, ambitious, and not afraid to play dirty. She rallied support in the north of England, building an army to challenge York's power. The conflict reignited with a vengeance. In 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, the Lancastrians achieved a crushing victory. Richard, Duke of York, was killed in the fighting, his head displayed on the walls of York, alongside those of his allies. But the Yorkist cause wasn't dead. Richard's son, Edward, Earl of March, stepped up to take his father's place. And Edward was different. Edward was young, charismatic, and a brilliant military leader. He quickly rallied the Yorkist forces, and in 1461, at the Battle of Towton, he won a decisive victory. Towton, it was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. Imagine tens of thousands of men, hacking and slashing at each other in the snow, the air thick with the screams of the dying. The Lancastrian army was utterly destroyed, and Henry VI and Margaret were forced to flee into exile. Edward was crowned King Edward IV. The House of York was in control, but peace never lasts for long, does it? Edward's reign wasn't smooth sailing. He faced rebellions, conspiracies, and a rather scandalous marriage. See, Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, and this annoyed a lot of the powerful nobles who had hoped he'd make a more politically advantageous match. One of these annoyed nobles was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Warwick, he was a powerful and ambitious man who had been instrumental in putting Edward on the throne. But after Edward's marriage and some political disagreements, Warwick switched sides. He formed an alliance with Margaret of Anjou, and in 1470, he restored Henry VI to the throne. Edward IV was forced to flee into exile himself. But Edward, he wasn't done yet. In 1471, Edward returned to England with an army. At the Battle of Barnet, he defeated Warwick, who was killed in the fighting. The Lancastrian cause suffered another devastating blow just weeks later at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Yorkists crushed the Lancastrian army, and Prince Edward, Henry VI's son and heir, was killed. Shortly after, Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London, likely on Edward's orders. With Henry VI and his son dead, the main Lancastrian line was extinguished. Edward IV was back on the throne, and this time he was determined to stay there. He ruled for over a decade, bringing a period of relative peace and prosperity to England. But even in times of peace, the seeds of future conflict can be sown. When Edward IV died in 1483, his young son Edward IV became king. But Edward IV was just a boy, and his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed protector of the realm. Richard, he was ambitious, ruthless, and, well, you probably know where this is going. Richard seized the throne for himself, declaring Edward IV and his younger brother illegitimate. The two young princes were imprisoned in the Tower of London, and they were never seen again. Richard became King Richard III. Richard's reign was short and turbulent. He faced rebellions and widespread opposition. People whispered about the missing princes, and Richard's reputation suffered. And then a new challenger emerged. Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the Lancastrian kings, landed in England with an army. At the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Henry defeated and killed Richard III. Richard was the last Yorkist king, and his death marked the end of the main line of the House of York. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. To unite the warring houses, he married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. This symbolically merged the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, creating the Tudor rose, which is still a symbol of England today. Henry VII established the Tudor dynasty, which would rule England for over a century. He brought stability to the country after decades of war and turmoil. He was a shrewd and calculating ruler who laid the foundations for England's rise to power in the 16th century. The Wars of the Roses, they were a brutal and complex period in English history. They were a struggle for power, fueled by ambition, betrayal, and a lot of bloodshed. They decimated the old nobility, weakened the monarchy, and paved the way for the Tudor dynasty. And they serve as a reminder that even the prettiest roses can have very sharp thorns. So there you have it, a brief and hopefully not too stimulating journey through the Wars of the Roses. Now, close your eyes, imagine the soft English rain falling on the fields of Bosworth, the clashing of steel, the whispers of conspiracy, and let the gentle rhythm of history lull you to sleep. Good evening, friends. Settle in, make sure you're comfortable. Tonight, we're delving into the world of medieval mercenaries, those soldiers of fortune who played a significant, often overlooked role in the tapestry of medieval warfare. Now, you might be picturing shining knights and chivalrous deeds, but the reality, as always, is a little more complicated. So dim the lights, relax your shoulders, and let's explore the rather pragmatic and sometimes downright ruthless world of medieval mercenaries. Who exactly were these mercenaries? Well, essentially, they were soldiers for hire, unlike feudal levies, who were obligated to serve their lord for a set period, or standing armies, which were relatively rare at this point in history. Mercenaries fought for whoever paid them the most. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a modern-day private military contractor, although of course without all the modern technology. The motivations of these soldiers were, unsurprisingly, primarily financial. While some may have had a taste for adventure or a genuine skill for combat, the bottom line was usually the promise of cold hard cash, or, whatever the medieval equivalent of cash was: silver, gold, land, plunder, you name it. For many, soldiering was a profession, a way to earn a living in a world where opportunities were often limited, especially for those who didn't inherit land or possess a particular trade. Now, where did these mercenaries come from? Pretty much everywhere. You'd find them from all corners of Europe and beyond. Some were landless knights or younger sons of noble families seeking their fortune. Others were simply experienced soldiers who had seen their share of battles and were looking for a steady paycheck. certain regions became known for producing particularly skilled or fearsome mercenaries. For example, Swiss pikemen were highly sought after for their discipline and effectiveness in infantry formations. Genoese crossbowmen were renowned for their skill with their, well, crossbows, and Flemish infantry were known for their, let's just say, their steadfastness. The availability of mercenaries fluctuated depending on various factors, such as the state of the economy, the level of conflict in Europe, and even the weather. A particularly harsh winter, for example, might drive more men to seek the relative security of a mercenary contract. So why did medieval rulers hire mercenaries in the first place? Well, there were several reasons. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, they offered a readily available source of trained soldiers. Raising a feudal levy could be time-consuming and unreliable, as lords might be reluctant to send their men off to fight in wars that didn't directly benefit them. Mercenaries, on the other hand, were ready to go at a moment's notice, provided the price was right. Secondly, mercenaries often possessed specialized skills or equipment that regular feudal levies lacked. We already mentioned the Swiss pikemen and Genoese crossbowmen, but there were also other specialists, such as siege engineers or experienced cavalrymen. Hiring these specialists could give an army a decisive advantage on the battlefield. Thirdly, and this is a little darker, mercenaries could be used to supplement or even replace less reliable troops. A king might not fully trust his own nobles, for instance, or might fear that his feudal levies would be more loyal to their local lords than to him. Mercenaries, on the other hand, were theoretically loyal only to the person paying them, making them a more reliable force in certain situations. However, relying on mercenaries wasn't without its drawbacks. Perhaps the biggest issue was their, shall we say, variable reliability. Mercenaries were, after all, motivated by money. If they weren't paid on time, or if they received a better offer from the other side, they might simply desert or even switch allegiances entirely. This could be disastrous for a ruler who was relying on them to win a battle or defend a territory. Another major problem was discipline, or rather, the lack thereof. Mercenaries were often notorious for their brutality and their willingness to plunder and pillage civilian populations, regardless of whether those civilians were enemies or allies. This could alienate local populations and undermine the legitimacy of the ruler who had hired them. There are numerous historical accounts of mercenary bands rampaging through towns and villages, looting, raping, and murdering with impunity. It was a constant struggle to keep them in line. The impact of mercenaries on the conduct of medieval warfare was significant. On the one hand, they increased the scale and intensity of conflicts. Rulers were able to field larger armies and wage longer wars thanks to the availability of hired soldiers. They also contributed to the professionalization of warfare, as armies became increasingly reliant on trained and experienced troops rather than hastily assembled levies. On the other hand, mercenaries also contributed to the brutality and chaos of medieval warfare. Their willingness to plunder and pillage, and their lack of loyalty to any particular cause, often led to widespread suffering and instability. The presence of large mercenary bands could destabilize entire regions, as they roamed the countryside looking for opportunities to loot and extort. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of the impact of mercenaries is the story of the Catalan Company. In the early 14th century, this band of Catalan mercenaries was hired by the Byzantine emperor to fight against the Turks. They were initially successful, but their rapacious behavior quickly alienated the local population. Eventually, they turned against their Byzantine employers and carved out their own independent state in Greece, which they ruled for several years. Their story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of relying on mercenaries, especially those with a reputation for greed and ruthlessness. In conclusion, medieval mercenaries were a complex and often contradictory phenomenon. They were a readily available source of military manpower, but they were also unreliable and prone to brutality. Their presence transformed the landscape of medieval warfare, contributing to both its scale and its savagery. They were soldiers of fortune, yes, but often at the expense of the very populations they were supposedly protecting. And with that cheerful thought, let's maybe not have sweet dreams tonight, but at least restful ones. Good evening, friends. As you settle in, let's turn our attention to a particularly forceful chapter in medieval history. A chapter written in blood, arrows, and the thunder of hooves. Tonight we're delving into the Mongol invasions, a new kind of warfare that swept across Asia and even threatened to engulf Europe. Now, before we drift off completely, let's acknowledge that the word invasion itself sounds rather clinical, doesn't it? Like a dentist's appointment. But these weren't mere border skirmishes or polite land grabs. These were devastating campaigns of conquest that reshaped entire continents. So, let's gently peel back the layers of history and see what made the Mongols such a formidable force and what the long-term impacts were. To understand the Mongol military machine, we need to understand the society that created it. The Mongols were, above all else, nomadic pastoralists. Life on the Central Asian steppe was harsh, demanding, and instilled a deep sense of self-reliance, discipline, and adaptability. Think of them as the ultimate survivalists, honed by centuries of living in one of the world's most challenging environments. Their entire culture revolved around horses. From a young age, Mongol children learned to ride, hunt, and fight from horseback. This created a nation of incredibly skilled and mobile warriors. Imagine, if you will, an army where nearly every soldier is a cavalryman, and not just any cavalryman, but one raised in the saddle, practically born with a bow in his hand. But it wasn't just individual skill that made the Mongols so effective. It was their organization, their tactics, and their leadership, particularly under the legendary Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan, originally named Temujin, was a brilliant and ruthless leader who united the disparate Mongol tribes into a single powerful force. He instituted a meritocratic system, promoting officers based on skill and loyalty, regardless of their social standing. This was a radical departure from the traditional tribal structures, and it allowed him to create a highly effective fighting force. The Mongol army was organized into units called tumans, each consisting of 10,000 men. These tumans were further divided into smaller units based on the decimal system, groups of 10, 100, and 1,000. This simple but effective organization allowed for clear lines of communication and command, crucial for coordinating large-scale maneuvers. And what maneuvers they were! The Mongols were masters of deception, feigned retreats, and flanking maneuvers. They used scouts extensively to gather intelligence about their enemies, their terrain, and their weaknesses. They were also adept at logistics, often living off the land and utilizing captured supplies to sustain their campaigns. One of their most famous tactics was the mangudai, or feigned retreat. The Mongols would attack an enemy force, then suddenly break and flee. The enemy, thinking they had won, would pursue, only to be ambushed by a hidden Mongol force. This tactic was incredibly effective at breaking enemy formations and inflicting heavy casualties. Another key element of Mongol warfare was their use of composite bows. These bows were made from layers of wood, bone, and sinew, glued together to create a weapon that was both powerful and accurate. Mongol archers could fire arrows with incredible speed and precision, even while riding at full gallop. This gave them a significant advantage over their enemies, who often relied on heavier, less accurate bows or melee weapons. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a rapid-fire sniper rifle. The Mongols also weren't afraid to use terror as a weapon. When a city resisted, they would often massacre the entire population as an example to others. This brutal tactic, while horrific, often had the desired effect of discouraging resistance and encouraging surrender. It created a climate of fear that spread throughout the regions they invaded. Now, let's turn our attention to the Mongol invasions themselves. Their expansion began in the early 13th century under Genghis Khan, who set his sights on conquering the world. Their first major target was northern China, then ruled by the Jin dynasty. After years of brutal warfare, the Mongols conquered northern China, adding its wealth and resources to their growing empire. Next, they turned westward, setting their sights on Central Asia and Persia. The Khwarezmian Empire, a large and powerful state, was their next target. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm was devastating. Cities were razed, populations were slaughtered, and the empire was completely destroyed. This campaign demonstrated the Mongols' utter ruthlessness and military prowess. From Persia, the Mongols continued their westward expansion, reaching Eastern Europe in the 1240s. The Mongol invasion of Europe was a shock to the system. European armies, accustomed to fighting each other in relatively small-scale conflicts, were completely unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the Mongol onslaught. The Mongols won a series of decisive victories, including the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223 and the Battle of Liegnitz in 1241. These victories sent shockwaves throughout Europe, with many fearing that the entire continent was about to be overrun. However, just as Europe seemed on the verge of collapse, the Mongol advance stalled. The death of the great Khan Ogedei in 1241 forced the Mongol leaders to return to Mongolia to elect a new leader. This gave Europe a much-needed respite, and the Mongols never again mounted a full-scale invasion of the continent. The Mongol invasions had a profound impact on both Asia and Europe. In Asia, they led to the destruction of many existing empires and the creation of new Mongol-ruled states, such as the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Yuan dynasty in China. They also facilitated trade and cultural exchange across the vast Mongol Empire, creating a period known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. In Europe, the Mongol invasions had a more limited but still significant impact. They exposed the weaknesses of European military organization and tactics, leading to reforms and innovations. They also disrupted trade routes and contributed to a period of political instability. But perhaps most importantly, they instilled a sense of fear and paranoia that lingered for centuries. The Mongol Empire eventually fragmented into several smaller khanates, which were gradually absorbed by neighboring states. But the legacy of the Mongol invasions lived on, shaping the political, cultural, and military landscape of Asia and Europe for centuries to come. So, as we drift off to sleep, let's remember the Mongol invasions, a new kind of warfare, a brutal reminder of the power of disciplined organization, adaptability, and yes, even terror. And perhaps, just perhaps, we can be thankful that their empire, as vast as it was, eventually faded into the mists of history. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be undisturbed by the thunder of hooves. Alright, let's settle in for this chapter, friends. Tonight, we're diving into the eerie and often overlooked impact of the Black Death on warfare in the medieval world. Now I know, the Black Death, it's grim stuff. But trust me, it's also a fascinating, if somewhat morbidly so, example of how a single event can reshape the course of history. And in this case, the history of war. So let's get comfortable, take a deep breath, and plunge into the chaos. The Black Death, you see, wasn't just a pandemic, it was a demographic catastrophe. We're talking about wiping out, conservatively, 30 to 60% of Europe's population in just a few short years during the mid-14th century. Some regions were hit even harder, losing as much as 80% of their inhabitants. Picture entire villages, bustling towns, and even parts of major cities simply vanishing, their populations decimated by this relentless plague. It's hard to even fathom that kind of loss. Now, how did this translate to the battlefield? Well, quite directly actually. The most immediate impact was on military recruitment. When you suddenly lose a huge chunk of your potential fighting force, raising an army becomes problematic. Lords and kings couldn't just snap their fingers and summon legions of loyal peasants anymore. There simply weren't enough peasants to summon. the pool of available men shrank dramatically, forcing rulers to get creative with their recruitment strategies. Feudal obligations, which traditionally relied on peasants providing military service in exchange for land, became increasingly difficult to enforce. Why? Because peasants now had leverage. They could say, hey, I could stay here and work your land, knowing I could die in some pointless war, or I could go find another lord who's willing to offer me better terms, maybe even pay me. Labor became scarce, and suddenly these lords had to compete for it. And that spilled over directly into their war efforts. This scarcity of manpower also led to a shift in the social composition of armies. Increasingly, armies relied on mercenaries. These soldiers of fortune, motivated primarily by financial gain, filled the gaps left by the dwindling ranks of feudal levies. Think about it. If you can't compel your own people to fight, you hire someone who wants to fight for the right price. But mercenaries weren't exactly known for their reliability. Their loyalty was often tied to their paychecks. If the money stopped flowing, so did their willingness to fight. This made military campaigns unpredictable and expensive. You suddenly have to consider all the logistical issues of paying a foreign army that could desert at any moment. And the more you rely on mercenaries, the more you risk alienating your own population. And speaking of logistics, oh boy did the Black Death throw a wrench into the gears of military supply chains. Supplying armies in the field was already a monumental challenge in the medieval period. But with fewer people to produce food, transport supplies, and maintain infrastructure, it became even more difficult. Imagine trying to feed, equip, and transport an army when half the farmers, blacksmiths, and wagon drivers are gone. The plague also disrupted trade routes. Fear of infection led to quarantines and travel restrictions, making it harder to move goods and supplies across regions. Cities, normally hubs of commerce and military logistics, became potential death traps. This forced armies to rely on local resources, which often weren't sufficient to sustain a large fighting force for an extended period. This in turn contributed to a rise in, well, let's call it opportunistic foraging. Armies desperate for supplies would often resort to pillaging and plundering the countryside. This not only alienated the local population, but also further disrupted agricultural production, creating a vicious cycle of scarcity and violence. Now let's talk about the conduct of war itself. The Black Death, in a strange way, may have actually shortened some conflicts. Commanders became more cautious, reluctant to risk their already depleted armies in prolonged campaigns. The risk of disease spreading within the ranks was simply too great. Siege warfare, for example, became even more perilous. Crowded conditions within besieged castles and fortified towns created ideal breeding grounds for disease. It wasn't uncommon for both besiegers and besieged to suffer heavy losses from plague and other illnesses, sometimes forcing them to abandon their efforts altogether. You have a massive army and a defensible position, but disease is the great equalizer. This fear of disease also influenced military tactics. Commanders were more likely to seek quick, decisive battles rather than drawn-out skirmishes or sieges. The goal was to achieve a swift victory and minimize exposure to potential infection. This put a premium on strategic thinking and decisive action. Interestingly, the Black Death may have also contributed to a decline in the chivalric ideals of warfare. With fewer nobles and knights available, armies increasingly relied on common soldiers and mercenaries who were less bound by the codes of chivalry. This led to a more brutal and pragmatic approach to warfare, where the ends often justified the means. The idea of honorable combat starts to slowly fade. The church's authority also took a hit. The inability of religious leaders to stop or even explain the plague shook people's faith. This questioning of authority extended to the justification of war, with some beginning to challenge the church's traditional support for military campaigns. If God isn't going to help, why should we continue to support the status quo? The long-term consequences of the Black Death on warfare were profound. The demographic changes it triggered led to a restructuring of medieval society, with significant implications for military organization, logistics, and the overall conduct of war. The rise of professional armies, the decline of feudal levies, and the increased reliance on mercenaries all can be, at least partially, attributed to the Black Death. The plague also accelerated the development of new military technologies and tactics. With manpower scarce, commanders looked for ways to increase the effectiveness of their armies. This led to innovations in weaponry, armor, and military strategy. Think more bang for your buck. For instance, the use of gunpowder weapons, which were already beginning to appear on the battlefield, became more widespread. Gunpowder weapons could inflict heavy casualties with relatively few soldiers, making them an attractive option for armies facing manpower shortages. Cannons became more common in sieges, and handguns started to appear on the battlefield, forever altering the face of warfare. Ultimately, the Black Death served as a brutal reminder of the fragility of human society and the unpredictable nature of history. It demonstrated how a single event, a microscopic organism, could reshape the course of civilization, leaving an indelible mark on warfare and the medieval world. And in many ways, it set the stage for the wars, technologies, and social structures that would define the Renaissance and the early modern period. So as we reflect on the Black Death and its impact on warfare, let us remember the millions who perished and the profound changes they left behind. Sleep well, friends, and may your dreams be free of plague and pestilence. Good evening, history lovers, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, let's gently unpack the idea of chivalry during the medieval period. You know those romantic notions of knights in shining armor, rescuing damsels in distress, and always behaving with honor? Ah, yes. Settle in, get comfy, and let's see how those ideals measured up to the, shall we say, somewhat less glamorous reality of medieval warfare. So chivalry, the word itself conjures up images of courage, courtesy, justice, and a certain flair. It was, at its core, a code of conduct, a set of ideals that medieval knights were supposed to live by. Think of it as the Middle Ages version of a corporate ethics manual, but with swords and horses. Only, instead of maximizing shareholder value, you were upholding God, protecting the weak, and looking good doing it. But where did this code come from? Well, it wasn't exactly handed down on stone tablets from Mount Camelot. It evolved gradually, over centuries, from a mix of influences. The church played a big role, trying to instill Christian values into what was often a pretty brutal warrior culture. Think of the church's efforts as damage control, attempting to curb all that pillaging, raping, and murder that tended to happen when large groups of armed men got together. Then there was the influence of courtly love. These were elaborate social rituals revolving around love and romance, usually unrequited love and romance. Knights were expected to show devotion to a noble lady, even if that devotion was completely platonic. And yes, you are allowed to have doubts about that platonic part. This all created a framework for how knights were supposed to treat women, especially those of higher social standing. This is where all those damsel in distress stories begin to take hold. Finally, there was the influence of feudal society itself. Knights were essentially landowners and vassals, owing service to their lords. Chivalry reinforced the social hierarchy, emphasizing loyalty, obedience, and the responsibilities that came with noble birth. Basically, chivalry became a tool to justify the existing power structure, making it sound all lofty and virtuous. So what were the key tenets of this chivalrous code? Well, loyalty to God and to your lord was paramount. A knight was expected to be a devout Christian and to faithfully serve his feudal superior. Courage was another essential virtue. Knights were supposed to be brave in battle, willing to face any enemy, no matter how fearsome. and bravery of course meant charging in first when the opportunity arose. Justice was also important. Knights were expected to uphold the law, protect the innocent, and punish wrongdoers. And well, who exactly defines wrongdoers remains, shall we say, flexible. Honor was perhaps the most valued attribute. A knight's reputation was everything, and he was expected to act in a way that would bring glory to himself, his family, and his lord. This all sounds so nice, doesn't it? So virtuous, so idealistic. Now here's where the brutal truth comes in. How often did medieval knights actually live up to these lofty ideals? The answer, my friends, is, it varied. A lot. The reality is that medieval warfare was often a messy, brutal, and decidedly unchivalrous affair. Remember our earlier chat about the treatment of civilians? Plunder, rape, and massacres were unfortunately not uncommon. Even knights who genuinely tried to be chivalrous sometimes found themselves in situations where they had to compromise their principles. War has a way of doing that. Let's talk about some specific examples, shall we? Take the Battle of Crécy in 1346, during the 100 Years' War. The English, armed with their deadly longbows, inflicted a devastating defeat on the French knights. The French, confident in their superior numbers and their noble status, charged recklessly into the English lines, only to be cut down by a hail of arrows. Sound chivalrous to you? And what about the treatment of prisoners? Chivalry dictated that knights should be treated with respect, and often they were, if they could afford a hefty ransom. Capturing a wealthy knight was a lucrative business, and many knights spent years in captivity, waiting for their families to scrape together enough money to buy their freedom. But if you were a common soldier, well, your chances of survival were much lower. Being ransomed was usually out of the question. You might be enslaved, or simply killed. Not exactly in the spirit of fair play, is it? Then there's the whole issue of siege warfare. Sieges were often long drawn-out affairs, marked by disease, starvation, and extreme brutality. Defenders would sometimes resort to desperate measures to hold out, including, say, catapulting diseased corpses over the walls to spread plague among the besiegers. Besiegers, meanwhile, might try to starve the defenders into submission, cutting off their supplies and leaving them to slowly wither away. Pretty sure there's nothing about throwing rotting bodies in the code of chivalry. And let's not forget about mercenaries. Medieval armies often relied on mercenaries to supplement their forces. These soldiers of fortune were motivated primarily by money, and they weren't particularly concerned with chivalrous niceties. They were often ruthless and unreliable, and they had a tendency to switch sides if a better offer came along. Again, not exactly the epitome of loyalty and honor. Okay, so chivalry wasn't always strictly adhered to, but that doesn't mean it was completely meaningless. There were definitely knights who tried to live up to the code, and there were instances of genuine chivalry in medieval warfare. It's easy to dismiss it all as a fantasy, but it's also fair to say that it did have an influence. Think about tournaments, for example. Tournaments were essentially staged battles, where knights could show off their skills and compete for prizes. They were also an opportunity to demonstrate chivalrous behavior. Knights were expected to treat their opponents with respect, even in the heat of competition. Tournaments provided a, well, arena for knights to practice their code of honor in a controlled environment. There are also documented cases of knights showing mercy to their enemies, even when they had the upper hand. After a battle, a victorious knight might spare the life of a defeated opponent, or treat him with kindness. These acts of chivalry, while perhaps rare, did happen, and they helped to reinforce the ideal. Ultimately, chivalry was a complex and often contradictory phenomenon. It was an ideal that was rarely fully realized, but it still shaped the way medieval knights thought about themselves and their role in society. It was a way of trying to impose order and morality on a world that was often chaotic and brutal. And while chivalry may not have always lived up to its promise, it did leave a lasting legacy. The ideals of courage, honor, and justice continue to resonate today, even if our modern understanding of those concepts has evolved. So next time you see a movie about knights in shining armor, remember that there was more to the story than just rescuing damsels and slaying dragons. There was also a healthy dose of messy reality, political maneuvering, and the ever-present tension between the ideal and the all-too-human. So close your eyes, picture those valiant knights, those grand castles, those clash of steel, and let those sounds, those images fade softly into the background as you drift off to sleep, knowing that even the most glorious eras have their shadowy, imperfect sides. Sleep well. Good evening, everyone. Settle in, make sure you're comfortable. Tonight we're wading into some truly unsettling aspects of medieval life, a topic that's, well, less about valiant knights and more about the stark realities faced by everyday people caught in the crossfire. We're delving into the treatment of civilians during medieval warfare, a subject often glossed over in favor of tales of heroic battles and chivalrous deeds. But as we've already established, the medieval world was rarely as romantic as the stories would have you believe. This section, well, it might be a bit disturbing, so just be aware of that, and if it gets to be too much, feel free to switch off and we'll pick it up again later, no worries. Now, let's get into it. One of the most pervasive realities of medieval warfare, one that directly impacted the lives of ordinary people, was plunder. The concept is simple enough. When an army marched through a territory, whether it was enemy land or even sometimes its own, its soldiers were often given free rein to take whatever they wanted. This wasn't just about acquiring supplies to keep the army going, it was often an accepted, even expected part of military life. Imagine you're a peasant farmer, living in a small village. You've worked tirelessly all year, tending your fields, raising your animals, just trying to provide for your family. Then, one day you see them coming, a large group of soldiers, their armor glinting in the sun. Maybe they're your own king's men, maybe they're from a rival kingdom, or perhaps even a band of mercenaries. Regardless, their arrival spells trouble. They descend upon your village, and suddenly everything changes. Your home is ransacked, your food stores are looted, your livestock is taken. Anything of value, tools, clothing, even furniture, is seized. The soldiers might claim they're just taking what they need, but often it's far more than that. It's about enrichment, about rewarding themselves for the hardships of war. And resistance, well, resistance was often met with violence. Plunder wasn't limited to just food and material goods. It often extended to personal property, including heirlooms, religious objects, and anything else that caught a soldier's eye. The psychological impact of this kind of violation must have been devastating. To see your home, your livelihood, your history just taken away, with no recourse, no justice. It's a loss that goes far beyond the material. Now, let's talk about something even more horrific. Rape was unfortunately a common occurrence during medieval warfare. While it was officially condemned by some authorities, in practice, it was often tolerated, ignored, or even tacitly encouraged. This isn't to say that every soldier engaged in sexual violence, but the fact that it happened so frequently, and with such impunity, speaks volumes about the brutal realities of the time. Imagine the fear, the terror, that women in these besieged villages must have felt. The threat of sexual violence was ever present, a constant shadow hanging over their lives. It's impossible to fully grasp the trauma, the lasting damage that these acts inflicted. And the silence surrounding these crimes, the lack of accountability, only compounded the suffering. Rape was used as a weapon of war, a way to demoralize the enemy, to assert dominance, to break the spirit of resistance. It was a way to humiliate not just the individual victims but their families, their communities, their entire culture. The impact of this kind of violence extends far beyond the immediate act. It creates a climate of fear, distrust, and lasting trauma that can affect generations. Now, massacres. These were sadly not uncommon events in medieval warfare. When a city or town resisted capture, or when an army felt particularly vengeful, the consequences for the civilian population could be catastrophic. These massacres could be driven by a number of factors: religious zeal, political opportunism, or simply the desire to instill fear and ensure future compliance. Think about the Albigensian Crusade, for example. The The town of Béziers was famously stormed in 1209, and the papal legate reportedly ordered the slaughter of everyone inside, regardless of whether they were heretics or Catholics. "Kill them all," he supposedly said, "God will recognize his own." Whether the exact words are true or not, it reflects the brutality of the time and the ruthlessness with which religious wars were often waged. The sack of Magdeburg in 1631, during the 30 Years' War, is another horrifying example. Imperial troops, after a long and difficult siege, stormed the city and subjected its inhabitants to unimaginable atrocities. Thousands were killed, homes were burned, and the city was left in ruins. These kinds of events, these massacres, weren't just about military objectives. They were about sending a message, about demonstrating the consequences of defiance. The psychological impact of living through a massacre must have been immeasurable. The loss of loved ones, the destruction of homes, the witnessing of unimaginable violence. These are experiences that can shatter a person's soul, and the survivors are left to rebuild their lives in the shadow of this trauma, carrying the burden of memory and the fear of future attacks. The motivations behind these acts of brutality were complex and varied. Sometimes it was about simple greed, the desire to acquire wealth and resources. Other times it was about asserting power, about demonstrating dominance over a conquered population. And sometimes it was about revenge, retaliating for past wrongs, real or perceived. Religious and ethnic differences also played a significant role. The Crusades, for example, were marked by extreme violence against both Muslim and Jewish populations. The idea of the other, the non-believer, often dehumanized these groups and made it easier to justify acts of cruelty and violence against them. The lack of effective command and control could also contribute to atrocities. Armies were often composed of diverse groups of soldiers, with varying levels of discipline and training. When commanders lost control, or when they simply turned a blind eye to the behavior of their troops, the consequences could be devastating for civilian populations. So what are we to make of all this? It's uncomfortable, I know. The treatment of civilians during medieval warfare was often brutal and inhumane. Plunder, rape, and massacres were all too common, and the consequences for ordinary people were devastating. While the stories of knights and battles might capture our imagination, it's important to remember the human cost of these conflicts. It's easy to romanticize the past, to focus on the heroic deeds and the grand narratives. But we must also acknowledge the darker aspects of history, the suffering and injustice that were often inflicted upon the most vulnerable members of society. By confronting these realities, we can gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of the medieval world, and perhaps even learn something about ourselves in the process. Now, I'm sure that's probably not the most sleep-inducing thing you've ever heard, so maybe let's take a little break here, just breathe deeply, and we'll move on to something a little lighter, something with just a little less horror in a little bit. Until then, sweet dreams, or at least peaceful thoughts. Alright, settle back friends, let's drift into the hushed aftermath of a medieval battle. You might want to adjust your pillow, find that comfy spot. Picture this, the clash of steel has faded, the war cries are silenced. The field, once a maelstrom of violence, now lies still, save for the groans of the wounded and, well, other things. This is the brutal truth about what happened after the fighting stopped. First, let's talk about casualties. Medieval warfare, it wasn't pretty. We're not talking neatly bandaged wounds and a quick trip to the infirmary. We're talking severe trauma. Arrows piercing flesh, swords cleaving limbs, axes splitting skulls. And remember, even if you survived the initial blow, infection was a massive killer. Think about it. No antibiotics, rudimentary surgery, and a battlefield teeming with unsanitary conditions. A small cut could quickly turn into a death sentence. Estimates vary wildly, but some battles could see casualty rates as high as 30% or even higher. That means nearly a third of the fighting force gone. And of those, a significant portion would succumb to their wounds in the days and weeks that followed. So what happened to the wounded? Well, that depended. If you were a knight or a noble, you had a much better chance. Your armor offered some protection, and your value as a prisoner meant someone was likely to patch you up to keep you alive for ransom, of course. Lower-ranking soldiers, not so much. They might get some rudimentary care from battlefield surgeons, often barbers, remember, using tools that were less than sterile. Think cauterization with hot irons, crude amputations. It was brutal. Many wounded were simply left to die, succumbing to blood loss, infection, or exposure. Now, let's talk about the unpleasant topic of the dead. What happened to the bodies? Well, again, it depended. If you were a nobleman, you might be identified by your heraldry and given a proper burial, perhaps even transported back to your ancestral lands for a grand funeral. But for the vast majority of common soldiers, mass graves, big pits dug on the battlefield, filled with the unceremoniously dumped corpses. Quick, efficient, and, well, disrespectful, perhaps, but necessary. Think about the sheer logistical nightmare of identifying and burying thousands of individual bodies, especially in a time before modern sanitation. Decomposition set in fast, and the stench, oh, the stench must have been overwhelming. Disease, scavengers, it was a race against time to dispose of the bodies before things got even worse. Sometimes, if the battle was particularly decisive, the victors might erect a monument, a cairn of stones or a simple wooden cross, to mark the location of the mass grave. But often the battlefield was simply abandoned, the dead left to rot into the earth, their bones becoming part of the landscape. Think about that, friends. The fields tilled, the crops grown, fertilized by the remains of those who fought and died there. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? And then there are the scavengers, not just animals, but people, locals, camp followers, anyone desperate enough to pick through the dead, looking for valuables, armor, weapons, clothing, anything that could be salvaged and sold. It was a grim business, stripping the corpses bare, but for some, it was the only way to survive. Now, let's shift our focus to another unfortunate group, the captured. What happened to the prisoners of war? Well, again, it really depended on your social status. If you were a knight, a noble, a person of wealth and influence, you were in luck, sort of. You were valuable, you were a commodity, you were held for ransom. Ransom was a huge part of medieval warfare. It was a financial incentive to capture rather than kill your enemies, especially those of high rank. Think of it as a medieval kidnapping scheme, but with slightly more rules perhaps, sort of. The amount of ransom demanded depended on your social standing, your wealth, and your perceived importance. It could be a fortune, enough to bankrupt a family, to cripple an estate. Negotiations could take weeks, months, even years. Letters would be sent back and forth, often through intermediaries, haggling over the price, arranging for payment. And during that time, the prisoner languished. Conditions varied. Some were treated relatively well, kept in comfortable quarters, allowed visitors. Others were thrown into dungeons, subjected to harsh treatment, even torture. It all depended on the captor, their motivations, and their basic decency, which, let's be honest, wasn't always a given. If your family couldn't afford the ransom, well, you were out of luck. You might be sold into slavery, forced to work the land, or simply left to rot in prison. The life of a prisoner of war in the Middle Ages was precarious, to say the least. But what about the lower-ranking soldiers, the archers, the spearmen, the common foot soldiers? They weren't worth much in ransom. So what happened to them? Well, the truth is, their fate was often far grimmer. Some might be enslaved, forced to work for their captors. Others might be simply killed. Mass executions of prisoners were not uncommon, especially after particularly bloody battles or sieges. Think about it. Feeding and housing thousands of prisoners was expensive and logistically challenging, and if you didn't want them to escape and rejoin the enemy, well, eliminating them was a permanent solution. Sometimes prisoners were released, but under very specific conditions. They might be forced to swear an oath never to fight against their captors again, or they might be forced to serve in their captor's army. It was all about weakening the enemy and bolstering your own forces. Now, let's talk about the ethics of all this, or rather, the lack of ethics by modern standards. Medieval warfare was brutal, and the treatment of prisoners and the disposal of the dead reflected that brutality. Chivalry, that supposed code of conduct for knights, well, it often went out the window in the heat of battle. There were some rules, some customs, some expectations of honorable behavior, but they were often ignored, especially when it came to dealing with those deemed to be less than worthy. Common soldiers, for example, were often seen as expendable, their lives worth far less than those of their noble counterparts. And the church, that supposed moral authority, well, it often turned a blind eye to the atrocities committed in the name of God or king. Just war theory attempted to set some ethical boundaries, but in practice it was often used to justify violence and oppression. The aftermath of a medieval battle was a grim and sobering sight, a landscape of death, destruction and despair, the wounded crying out for help, the dead lying unburied, the captured facing an uncertain future. It was a reminder of the brutal realities of war, the human cost of ambition, greed, and religious fanaticism. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, friends, remember those who fought and died in those long ago battles. Remember the pain, the suffering, the sheer horror of it all, and be grateful for the relative peace and comfort we enjoy today. Sleep well. Good evening, friends. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. As we settle in for our nightly historical exploration, tonight we will be taking a look at a more sensitive topic: the brutal medical practices of the medieval battlefield. I know that sounds a little scary, but I promise to keep it as calm and peaceful as possible. Now, snuggle up, relax, and let's gently wander back in time. Let's not beat around the bush, friends. The state of medical knowledge during the medieval period wasn't great. Our understanding of anatomy, disease and infection was, shall we say, limited. We hadn't yet made the groundbreaking discoveries about germs and the circulatory system that would revolutionize medicine later on. And that meant that battlefield medicine was often a gruesome affair of trial and error. Now, when a soldier was struck down on the field of battle, his chances of receiving any kind of effective treatment were slim. The sheer chaos of combat made it difficult to reach the wounded, and even when they were reached, the resources available were woefully inadequate. There was no organized system of battlefield evacuation or triage. Instead, wounded men were left to fend for themselves, or rely on the help of their comrades. So who were these battlefield healers, you might ask? Well, you had a mix of people tending to the wounded. Some armies had dedicated surgeons, although their training and skill levels varied widely. These surgeons often learned their trade through apprenticeships, and their knowledge was based more on practical experience than on any kind of formal scientific education. Barber surgeons were common too. As the name suggests, these individuals combined the skills of a barber with those of a surgeon. In addition to cutting hair and shaving beards, they also performed minor surgical procedures such as bloodletting and wound dressing. Monks and other members of the clergy also provided medical care, drawing on their knowledge of herbal remedies and their compassion for the sick and injured. But let's be honest, friends, none of these were quite what we'd call state-of-the-art. But what about the medical knowledge itself? Well, much of it was based on ancient Greek and Roman texts, particularly the writings of Galen and Hippocrates. While these texts contained some valuable insights, they also included a lot of misinformation and outdated theories. For example, the prevailing belief was that disease was caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment therefore focused on restoring the balance of these humours through methods such as bloodletting, purging and sweating. The idea was that if you removed some blood or made someone vomit, you could re-establish a healthier balance. It sounds barbaric to us now, but this was considered cutting-edge medicine at the time. Let's say a soldier sustained a wound. The first step was usually to clean it, or what passed for cleaning at the time. Wounds were often flushed with boiling oil or cauterized with hot irons. Now, I know that sounds incredibly painful and awful, but the thinking was that this would seal the wound and prevent infection. Unfortunately, it often did more harm than good, causing further tissue damage and increasing the risk of complications. Remember friends, they didn't know about germs. And speaking of preventing infection, antiseptic techniques were non-existent. Surgical instruments were rarely sterilized, and bandages were often reused without being properly cleaned. This of course led to rampant infections, which were a major cause of death on the battlefield. One common infection was gangrene, a particularly nasty condition that caused tissue to decay and rot. Treatment for gangrene typically involved amputation, often performed without anesthesia. Broken bones were another common injury on the medieval battlefield. Setting a fracture was a difficult and painful process, often involving the use of splints and bandages to immobilize the injured limb. In some cases, surgeons might attempt to realign the broken bones by applying traction or manipulating the limb. Again, anesthesia was rarely available, so the patient had to endure the procedure as best they could. Amputation, as I mentioned before, was a frequent occurrence. If a limb was severely damaged or infected, amputation was often the only option to save the patient's life. Amputations were typically performed with a saw, and the stump was then cauterized to stop the bleeding. Ouch. Tourniquets were sometimes used to control blood loss, but they were not always effective. The pain, of course, was excruciating, and many patients died from shock or blood loss during or after the procedure. Anesthesia, or rather, the lack of it, was one of the most brutal aspects of medieval battlefield medicine. While some surgeons used herbal remedies or alcohol to dull the pain, these were often ineffective. Most patients simply had to grit their teeth and bear it. Imagine undergoing a major surgical procedure while fully conscious, feeling every cut and every sore stroke. It's a truly horrifying thought. Pain management, as you can imagine, was pretty much non-existent. Soldiers were sometimes given alcohol to numb the pain, or perhaps some herbal concoctions, but that was about it. Opium, a powerful painkiller, was known at the time, but it wasn't widely used on the battlefield. Now, let's not forget the psychological impact of all this on the soldiers themselves. Imagine witnessing these horrors firsthand, seeing your comrades maimed and killed, and knowing that your own chances of survival were slim. The psychological toll of medieval warfare must have been immense, leading to trauma, depression, and other mental health issues that were poorly understood at the time. We often hear about physical scars, but these psychological wounds would have been deeply painful too. Despite all these challenges though, there were some instances of surprisingly effective medical care on the medieval battlefield. Some surgeons developed innovative techniques for wound closure and fracture management. Herbal remedies were sometimes used to treat infections and ease pain, and perhaps most importantly, there was a strong sense of camaraderie among soldiers who often looked out for each other and provided comfort and support in times of need. So what can we learn from all this? Well, I think it's important to remember that medical knowledge and practices are constantly evolving. What seems barbaric to us today may have been considered state-of-the-art in the past. It's also important to appreciate the courage and resilience of the soldiers who fought and suffered on the medieval battlefield, and the dedication of the healers who did their best to care for them in the face of overwhelming challenges. But as we drift off to sleep, let us be grateful for the advanced medical care available today, and for the knowledge and understanding that allows us to treat injuries and illnesses with compassion and effectiveness. Let's also remember that even in the darkest of times, kindness and human connection can make a difference. Now breathe deeply and let this all drift away. Alright, settle in friends. Tonight we're not storming any castles or leading any charges. Instead, we're following the money. Because even back then, as now, war was a very, very expensive business. Tonight we're going to be looking at the economics of medieval warfare, and trust me, it's more fascinating and probably more important than you might think. So imagine you're a medieval king or lord. You've got a beef with your neighbor, or maybe you just fancy expanding your territory. Either way, you need an army. But armies don't just magically appear, right? They need to be raised, equipped, and fed. And all of that costs a lot of money. Let's break it down, shall we? First, there's the matter of recruitment. Now, in the early Middle Ages, armies were often based on feudal obligations. Basically, if you held land from the king, you owed him military service. You and your men would show up when he called, bringing your own weapons and armor. Sounds cheap, right? Well, not really. Even if you weren't paying your soldiers directly, you were still relying on a system that tied up land and labor, and that had economic consequences. Plus, these feudal levies were often unreliable. They might not be well trained, they might not be enthusiastic about fighting, and they certainly didn't want to be away from their farms for too long. As time went on, rulers started to rely more on paid soldiers, especially for longer campaigns. And that's where things got really expensive. You had to offer attractive wages to lure men to your banner. And it wasn't like signing a simple contract. You'd need recruiters, scribes, notaries to authenticate papers. And then you need to trust all of these people involved with the process to do their jobs correctly and not be skimming off the top. The cost of a soldier varied depending on his skills and equipment. A simple foot soldier might earn a few pennies a day, while a skilled knight, with his horse and armor, could command a much higher wage. And don't forget, these guys had families to support. They'd expect some kind of compensation for their sacrifice, maybe a share of the spoils if they won, or at least some assurance that their families would be taken care of if they didn't come home. Then comes the equipment. We're not talking about a plastic sword and shield from a toy shop here. We're talking about real functional tools of war, and they weren't cheap. A decent sword could cost as much as a cow. A full suit of plate armor, the kind that knights wore in the later Middle Ages, could cost more than a small farm. We're talking generational wealth to protect one person. It wasn't just the armor either. They'd need horses, weapons, shields, lances, padded undergarments, because wearing metal all day is really uncomfortable, and all that needs to be maintained, repaired and replaced when it gets damaged. Imagine a knight needing a new helmet mid-battle. Someone's going to have to pay for that. And it's not just the individual equipment. Think about siege warfare. Huge trebuchets, siege towers, scaling ladders, all of that requires skilled craftsmen, tons of materials, and a lot of time to build. We're talking about massive infrastructure projects, but only used for destroying other infrastructure. Speaking of materials, where do they come from? Iron ore has to be mined, smelted, and forged into weapons and armor. Wood has to be felled, seasoned, and shaped into siege engines. Cloth has to be woven and dyed for uniforms and banners. All of this requires a vast network of suppliers, artisans, and merchants. And they all need to be paid or compelled to supply, either with money, force, or some mixture of the two. And finally, there's logistics. How do you feed an army of thousands of men? How do you transport all that equipment across long distances? How do you keep them supplied while they're laying siege to a castle? Medieval armies relied heavily on supply trains, which meant wagons, horses, and drivers. And these supply trains were vulnerable to attack, so they needed to be protected. That meant even more soldiers, and even more expenses. Medieval armies often relied on foraging, which basically meant stealing food from the local population. And while this might have saved the ruler some money in the short term, it was hardly a sustainable strategy. It alienated the locals, disrupted agriculture, and could lead to famine and disease, which in turn could weaken the army. In short, it was a terrible strategy with massive long-term ramifications that were hard to predict or calculate. So how did medieval rulers finance all of this? Well, there were basically three main sources of revenue: taxation, plunder, and loans. Let's start with taxation. Taxation in the Middle Ages was a complex and often unpopular business. There was no standardized tax system, and the amount that rulers could collect depended on their power and the willingness of their subjects to pay. Kings would levy taxes on land, on trade, and on specific events, like weddings or funerals, and they'd often resort to desperate measures, like debasing the coinage, reducing the amount of precious metal in coins, which led to inflation and economic instability. It's like a government printing money today, but with even more uncertainty. Collecting taxes was also a challenge. There was no efficient bureaucracy, so rulers had to rely on local officials, who were often corrupt or incompetent. And there was always the risk of rebellion, especially if the taxes were too high or perceived as unfair. Think about Robin Hood, right? While a fictional character, he became a symbol of resistance to unjust taxation. It's a romanticized version, of course, but it shows that people were definitely unhappy about heavy taxation, to say the least. Next, there's plunder. Looting enemy territory was a common way to finance wars, especially in the early Middle Ages. After a successful battle or siege, soldiers were allowed to plunder the defeated enemy, taking anything they could get their hands on. This could be a lucrative source of income for both the soldiers and the ruler, but it also had its downsides. Plunder could be brutal and indiscriminate, leading to massacres, rape, and destruction, and it often alienated the local population, making it harder to control the conquered territory. It also made diplomacy and negotiation much harder. What is there to negotiate when everyone is simply stealing from each other? Finally, there were loans. Medieval rulers often borrowed money from wealthy merchants, bankers, or even the church to finance their wars. These loans could be incredibly expensive, with high interest rates and strict repayment terms. And if the ruler couldn't repay the loan, the consequences could be dire. Lenders might seize royal assets, or even support a rival claimant to the throne. This is what happens when your local loan shark gets involved with international power politics. The church, despite its supposed commitment to peace, was often a major lender to medieval rulers. The Knights Templar, a powerful religious order, became famous for their banking activities, lending money to kings and nobles across Europe. But the Templars eventually ran afoul of the French king Philip IV, who was heavily indebted to them. He had them arrested, tortured, and executed, seizing their assets and effectively wiping out his debt. It's a brutal example of how risky it could be to lend money to a medieval ruler. So the economics of medieval warfare were a complex and often brutal business. Raising, equipping, and maintaining armies cost a fortune, and rulers had to rely on a variety of sources to finance their wars, including taxation, plunder, and loans. Each of these methods had its own downsides, and the consequences of failure could be devastating. Next time you see a movie about knights and castles, remember that behind all the glory and heroism, there was a whole lot of accounting going on, and a whole lot of people trying to figure out how to pay for it all. Sleep tight. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. I hope you're feeling nice and cozy. Let's gently drift into another historical nook, shall we? Tonight, we're tracing the twilight of medieval warfare, a transition as slow and inevitable as the setting sun. So snuggle down, relax those shoulders, and let's explore the decline of knights and castles. For centuries, the rhythms of war had been dictated by the seasons, by the code of chivalry, and by the limitations of human muscle. But as the late Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, two game-changing forces began to reshape the battlefield: gunpowder weapons and professional armies. Now I know what you might be thinking. Gunpowder, didn't they have cannons in medieval times? And yes, rudimentary cannons did appear as early as the 13th century, but these early artillery pieces were more dangerous to their operators than to their targets. Imagine a giant iron pot, prone to exploding at any moment, firing a large stone ball with unpredictable accuracy. They were loud, unreliable, and incredibly expensive, more for show than for actual battle. Early gunpowder wasn't even very powerful. Think of it as more of a loud bang with a puff of smoke than a devastating explosion. But as time went on, gunpowder technology steadily improved. Metallurgists developed stronger cannons that could withstand higher pressures. Gunpowder recipes became more refined, leading to more powerful explosions. And perhaps most importantly, gunners became more skilled in aiming and deploying their weapons. One of the first major turning points was the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The English army, though outnumbered, deployed relatively small cannons alongside their archers. While the cannons didn't inflict massive casualties, their noise and smoke terrified the Genoese crossbowmen fighting for the French. This disruption played a significant role in the English victory. It was like a scary distraction, rather than a real threat. But it did its job. Over the next century, cannons became increasingly prevalent on the battlefield. They were particularly effective in siege warfare. The thick walls of medieval castles, once thought to be impenetrable, proved surprisingly vulnerable to sustained bombardment. Think about it, those massive stone walls, designed to withstand catapults and trebuchets, were no match for the concussive force of a cannonball. Siege warfare had always been a long drawn-out affair, often lasting months or even years, but cannons could breach castle walls in a matter of days or even hours. This dramatically reduced the time and cost of sieges, making castles far less valuable as defensive structures. Imagine a castle lord, sitting safely behind his thick walls, confident in his defenses. Then suddenly, boom, a cannonball crashes through his wall, sending stone and debris flying everywhere. Suddenly that castle doesn't seem so safe anymore, does it? But the impact of gunpowder wasn't limited to siege warfare. Handheld firearms like the arquebus and the musket also began to appear on the battlefield. These early firearms were slow to load, inaccurate, and prone to misfires. But they had one major advantage over traditional weapons. They required relatively little training to use. A peasant conscript could be taught to load and fire a musket in a matter of weeks, whereas it took years of training to become a skilled archer or knight. This meant that armies could be raised more quickly and cheaply than ever before. It wasn't a case of needing a lifelong dedication to fighting. You just needed to know where the pointy end was. Now, the early firearms weren't very effective against heavily armored knights. A musket ball might dent or scratch plate armor, but it was unlikely to penetrate it. But as armor evolved, so did firearms. By the 16th century, firearms became powerful enough to pierce even the thickest plate armor at close range. This rendered the traditional knight, with his expensive armor and years of training, increasingly obsolete. Think about the impact. For centuries, the knight had been the king of the battlefield, the ultimate symbol of military power. But now a common soldier with a relatively cheap firearm could kill a knight with a single shot. It was a truly revolutionary change. Suddenly, all that expensive armor wasn't really worth it anymore. And that brings us to the second major factor in the decline of medieval warfare, the rise of professional armies. In the early Middle Ages, armies were typically raised on a feudal basis. Lords were obligated to provide soldiers to their king or overlord in times of war. These soldiers, often poorly trained and equipped, were primarily motivated by feudal obligation rather than a desire for pay or glory. As warfare became more complex and expensive, feudal levies became increasingly inadequate. Kings and nobles began to rely more and more on mercenary soldiers, professional fighters who were paid for their services. These mercenaries were often more skilled and disciplined than feudal levies, and they were available year-round, not just during the campaigning season. They were dedicated, and that meant results. But mercenaries were also notoriously unreliable. They were often more interested in plunder than in fighting for their employer's cause. And if they weren't paid on time, they were prone to mutiny or even switch sides in the middle of a battle. Imagine how frustrating that would be. You think you've hired a loyal army, but they just see the money and don't care who they fight for. To overcome these problems, rulers began to create standing armies, permanent professional forces that were directly under their control. These armies were composed of full-time soldiers who were paid regularly and trained extensively. They were also subject to strict discipline and a clear chain of command. A professional army was more predictable, and that was essential for success. One of the earliest and most successful examples of a standing army was the French Compagnies d'Ordonnance, created by King Charles VII in the mid-15th century. These companies consisted of heavily armed cavalry supported by archers and infantry. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and fiercely loyal to the king. The French finally took the upper hand in the 100 Years' War, thanks to this new army. The rise of standing armies had a profound impact on warfare. It allowed rulers to project military power more effectively, both at home and abroad. It also led to the development of more sophisticated military tactics and strategies. No longer was it a bunch of knights charging around, there were formations and planned attacks. And perhaps most importantly, the rise of standing armies led to a decline in the importance of the individual warrior. In the medieval era, a single knight could make a decisive difference in a battle. But in the age of gunpowder and professional armies, warfare became a more collective endeavor. Success depended on the coordination and discipline of entire units, rather than the individual skill or bravery of a single soldier. Think about it. In a pike square, hundreds of soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, bristling with long spears, forming an impenetrable wall against enemy cavalry. It didn't matter if one or two soldiers were particularly skilled or brave. What mattered was that the entire unit held its ground. That's a really important shift. The transition from medieval to early modern warfare was a gradual process, not a sudden revolution. But by the 16th century, the key elements of the new style of warfare were in place: gunpowder weapons, professional armies, and more centralized states that could afford to maintain them. The old ways of warfare, with their emphasis on chivalry, individual combat, and feudal obligations, were increasingly relegated to the past. The battlefield became a more brutal, impersonal, and efficient place. The knight in shining armor gave way to the disciplined musketeer. The age of castles was over, replaced by the age of fortifications designed to withstand cannon fire. It was a new era, whether people liked it or not. And with that, the long, slow decline of medieval warfare came to its inevitable conclusion. It was a transition driven by technological innovation, changing social structures, and the ever-present pressures of war. It was a process that transformed not only the way wars were fought, but also the very nature of power and society. I hope this gentle exploration of the decline of medieval warfare has helped you to relax and unwind. As the sounds of battle fade into the distance, let's take a deep breath and prepare for a peaceful night's sleep. Pleasant dreams, everyone. Alright friends, settle in, let's dim the lights and prepare to consider the legacy of medieval warfare. It's a hefty topic, but we'll get through it together, gently. Think of this as mental floss for the history buff. Interesting, but hopefully not too stimulating. So when we talk about the legacy of something as messy and brutal as medieval warfare, what exactly are we talking about? Well, it's the ripples, the long-term effects that stretched out beyond the battlefield, influencing not just military thinking, but also technology, society, and even the way we think about conflict today. First off, let's consider military strategy. Did the Middle Ages give us anything truly lasting? Absolutely. Think about the concept of total war. Now that's a scary term, but it's not a modern invention. Medieval warfare, especially during periods like the 100 Years' War, often involved the systematic destruction of enemy resources. Sieges weren't just about capturing a castle, they were about crippling the surrounding area, burning crops, and generally making life unbearable for the civilian population to weaken the enemy's ability to wage war. This ruthlessness, this targeting of civilian infrastructure, foreshadows later concepts of total war. The medieval period also cemented the importance of fortification as a key element of strategic thinking. Castles, as we've discussed, weren't just piles of rocks. They were strategically placed to control key terrain, disrupt enemy movements, and provide secure bases for offensive operations. The investment in castle building was a testament to the long-term importance of controlling territory, and the cat-and-mouse game of siege and counter-siege shaped military thinking for centuries. The legacy there is that idea that controlling land matters, and that defense can be just as potent as offense. Then there's the development of specialized military orders. Groups like the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights were essentially standing armies, highly trained and dedicated to specific strategic goals. They were precursors to modern special forces units. They also demonstrate the ongoing interplay between religion, politics, and military strategy. This concept of a dedicated, highly skilled fighting force with a specific mission resonated long after the medieval period ended. Now, let's talk technology. It's probably what you think of first, and for good reason. The medieval period was a time of constant innovation in weaponry. While we might romanticize the knight in shining armor, the reality is that medieval armies were constantly experimenting with new ways to kill each other more efficiently. And those innovations had lasting consequences. Consider the longbow. This seemingly simple weapon revolutionized warfare in the late medieval period. It gave the English a decisive advantage in battles like Crécy and Agincourt, proving that a well-trained archer could be more effective than a heavily armored knight. The longbow's legacy is that the power of ranged weapons can overcome traditional close-quarters combat, and that well-trained commoners are often better than nobility. And of course, we can't forget gunpowder. Now, gunpowder weapons were initially pretty crude, noisy, and unreliable, but their introduction marked a turning point in military history. Cannons gradually became more effective at smashing castle walls, rendering traditional fortifications obsolete. Handguns, though initially inaccurate, eventually evolved into the firearms that would dominate battlefields for centuries to come. The legacy of gunpowder is obvious. Warfare is no longer about brute strength and personal courage, but about technology and firepower. But the legacy of medieval weaponry extends beyond the battlefield. The development of metallurgy, driven by the demand for better armor and weapons, spurred advances in other fields. The techniques used to forge swords and plate armor were also applied to making tools, machines, and other useful objects. So even though medieval warfare was destructive, it also indirectly contributed to technological progress. But what about the non-military aspects? Did medieval warfare leave any lasting social or political impacts? Again, absolutely. One of the most significant legacies is the development of the nation-state. The constant warfare of the medieval period, particularly conflicts like the 100 Years' War, helped to forge a sense of national identity in countries like England and France. People started to identify themselves as English or French first, and as subjects of a particular lord second. This growing sense of national identity was a key factor in the rise of centralized monarchies and the formation of modern nation-states. The need to raise armies and finance wars also had a profound impact on governance. Medieval rulers were constantly looking for new ways to extract resources from their populations. This led to the development of more sophisticated systems of taxation, bureaucracy, and administration. The legacy here is that warfare drives the development of state power, and the need to wage war shapes the structure of government. Then there's the role of mercenaries. While often viewed negatively, mercenaries played a crucial role in medieval warfare. They provided skilled manpower when and where it was needed, and their existence helped to professionalize warfare. The legacy of the mercenary is that war becomes a business. And let's not forget the impact on chivalry and the code of conduct. While the ideals of chivalry were often ignored in practice, they did represent an attempt to regulate warfare and mitigate its worst excesses. The concept of just war, developed by medieval theologians, sought to establish moral limits on the use of violence. While these ideals were often violated, they did provide a framework for thinking about the ethics of warfare. Finally, it's important to recognize the cultural legacy of medieval warfare. The stories of knights, battles, and sieges have inspired countless works of art, literature, and film. We still romanticize the medieval period, even though we know it was often brutal and unpleasant. This fascination with the Middle Ages reflects our ongoing interest in conflict, courage, and the human condition. So in conclusion, the legacy of medieval warfare is complex and multifaceted. It shaped military strategy, spurred technological innovation, contributed to the rise of the nation-state, and influenced our cultural imagination. While we might recoil at the brutality of medieval warfare, we can't deny its lasting impact on the world we live in today. And with that, let's gently close the book on that chapter, shall we? Pleasant dreams, everyone. So as we reach the end of our somewhat, let's say, gritty journey through the landscape of medieval warfare, it's time to really let the weight of what we've discussed settle in. I know, this isn't exactly the fluffy clouds and happy sheep kind of bedtime story you might be used to, but sometimes understanding the harsh realities of the past is, well, it's important, even if it makes you want to pull the covers a little tighter and appreciate the peace we mostly enjoy today. Let's gently recap, shall we? We started by shattering the romanticized image of shining knights and chivalrous battles. Instead, we dove headfirst into the muck and mire of the medieval battlefield. A battlefield, remember, that was often as much an enemy as the opposing army. The terrain, the weather, the sheer difficulty of getting supplies to the front lines, it all played a huge role in shaping the conflicts of the time. It wasn't just about brave warriors clashing steel, it was about surviving disease, starvation, and the elements, often before the first arrow even flew. And speaking of warriors, we took a look at who these people actually were. Not just kings and nobles, but the vast majority, the common soldiers. The guys conscripted from their farms, the mercenaries fighting for a bit of coin, the truly devout who believed they were doing God's work. We saw how their motivations were varied, often complex, and very rarely about pure glory. It was about duty, about survival, and sometimes just about following orders. Then we delved into the tools of their trade, the arms and armor. We traced the evolution from simple axes and shields to the later, more sophisticated plate armor. But even then, remember, armor wasn't some magical invincibility suit. It was heavy, it was expensive, and it had its weaknesses. And a well-placed blow, or a lucky shot from a longbow, could still bring down the most heavily armored knight. Castles, those iconic symbols of the Middle Ages, got their due. We saw how they were far more than just pretty stone structures. They were strategic strongholds, centers of power, and of course magnets for sieges. And siege warfare, well, that was a whole other level of brutal. The long drawn-out affairs, the starvation tactics, the disease, the constant threat of attack. It was a war of attrition that could grind down even the most determined defenders. Infantry tactics weren't exactly elegant either. Shield walls, pike squares, these were formations designed for survival, for maximizing the effectiveness of a group of men against a charging enemy. It was about discipline, about holding your ground, and about trusting the guy next to you to do the same. Cavalry, those imposing knights on horseback, were a force to be reckoned with, for sure, but we also saw their limitations. A well-prepared infantry formation could break a cavalry charge, and even the mightiest knight was vulnerable when his horse went down. We couldn't forget the seas. Medieval naval warfare, with its ramming tactics and boarding actions, was just as visceral and unforgiving as anything on land. Controlling the sea lanes meant controlling trade, controlling supply lines, and ultimately controlling power. Archery got its moment in the spotlight, with the English longbow and the crossbow proving their deadly effectiveness against armored opponents. These weren't just simple bows and arrows, they were technologically advanced weapons that could change the course of a battle. The church, always a powerful influence in the Middle Ages, played a complex role in warfare, from developing the concept of just war to fueling the fervor of the Crusades. Religion was both a justification for conflict and sometimes a restraint on its excesses. And the Crusades, those religiously motivated campaigns, were a stark example of the brutality that could be unleashed in the name of faith. The sieges, the massacres, the sheer suffering inflicted on both sides. It was a dark chapter in history, driven by a potent mix of religious zeal and worldly ambition. The 100 Years' War, that seemingly endless conflict between England and France, showed how warfare was evolving. New technologies, new tactics, and new forms of military organization were all emerging, slowly but surely changing the face of battle. Even internal conflicts, like the Wars of the Roses in England, were incredibly brutal. Dynastic struggles, political intrigue, and bloody battles. It was a period of turmoil that left a lasting impact on the English monarchy. We touched upon the role of mercenaries, those soldiers of fortune who fought for whoever paid them the most. While sometimes effective, they were also notoriously unreliable, often switching sides or simply deserting when the pay wasn't good enough. Then, we had the shock of the Mongol invasions, where a new kind of warfare burst onto the scene. Their tactics, their discipline, and their sheer ruthlessness were unlike anything Europe had seen before. The Black Death, that devastating pandemic, had a profound impact on warfare. The massive loss of life disrupted everything, from military recruitment to logistics, and ultimately changed the course of history. We glanced at the concept of chivalry, that supposed code of conduct for knights. While there were certainly examples of honorable behavior, the reality of medieval warfare often fell far short of the ideal. The treatment of civilians was often horrific, with instances of plunder, rape, and massacres being all too common. War wasn't just about armies clashing, it was about the devastating impact on the lives of ordinary people. The aftermath of battle was grim, with the wounded, captured, and dead left to face their fates. Ransoms were paid, prisoners were sometimes treated decently, sometimes not, and the bodies were disposed of, often in mass graves. Medical practices on the battlefield, well, let's just say they were limited. With a lack of understanding of infection and sanitation, even the simplest wound could become deadly. The economics of warfare were staggering. Raising, equipping, and maintaining armies was incredibly expensive, and medieval rulers had to find ways to finance their conflicts, whether through taxation, plunder, or loans. And finally, we saw how the decline of medieval warfare was driven by the rise of gunpowder weapons and the development of professional armies. The old ways were slowly being replaced by new technologies and new forms of military organization. So after all that, what's the takeaway? What's the brutal truth that we're left with? It's this: medieval warfare was in almost every way a brutal, unforgiving affair. It was a world of violence, disease, and constant threat. The romanticized images we often see in movies and books are a far cry from the reality. It was a world where the line between soldier and civilian was often blurred, where the rules of engagement were often ignored, and where the consequences of conflict were devastating, not just for those who fought, but for entire societies. It's easy to get lost in the details of battles and sieges, in the descriptions of weapons and armor, but it's important to remember the human cost of all this, the suffering, the loss, and the sheer waste of human potential. Medieval warfare shaped the course of history, of course. It influenced the development of states, the rise and fall of empires, and the evolution of military technology. But it's also a reminder of the dark side of human nature, of our capacity for violence and destruction. Now, I'm not saying all this to bum you out, or to give you nightmares, but I do think it's important to acknowledge the less than pretty aspects of history. to understand the sacrifices that were made, the suffering that was endured, and the lessons that we can hopefully learn from the past. And maybe, just maybe, by understanding the brutal truth about medieval warfare, we can better appreciate the relative peace and stability that we enjoy today. A peace that, while certainly not perfect, is built on the shoulders of those who came before us, and who endured hardships that we can scarcely imagine. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, try to hold on to that thought. Appreciate the warmth of your bed, the safety of your home, and the relative tranquility of your world. And remember, the next time you see a movie about shining knights and glorious battles, to take it with a grain of salt, because the real story of medieval warfare is a lot more complicated, a lot more brutal, and a lot more, well, real. Sweet dreams, friends, and may your sleep be peaceful, and your world a little bit brighter for having faced the truths of the past.